Welcome back to another story on Vision Harry. This time, we're bringing you Gringotts' test at age 9 showed Harry as Lord of 15 houses and Dumbledore renting his properties. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Weight of Gold. The thing about the Dursleys was that they were predictable. Harry had learned this the way most children learn important things, through pain, repetition, and the gradual understanding that the adults around him were not going to change, and so he would have to. Uncle Vernon woke angry and went to bed angry, with a brief intermission of contentment when his dinner was on the table and the television was loud and nobody required anything of him. Aunt Petunia cleaned things that weren't dirty and ignored things that were. Dudley took what he wanted and screamed for more. Harry, in the middle of all this, had become very good at being invisible. He was 9 years old and small for his age, with knobbly knees and glasses that sat crooked on his nose because Dudley had sat on them twice and nobody had replaced them properly either time. His hair did whatever it wanted. His clothes were Dudley's old things, sized for a boy twice his width, and he had learned to roll the waistbands and tuck the hems and generally perform small miracles of alteration with nothing but determination and a safety pin he'd found behind the washing machine. It was a Tuesday in late July when Petunia told him he was coming with her to London. She said it the way she said most things to Harry, not looking at him directly, addressing somewhere in the vicinity of his left ear. "I have an errand in that shopping district. You'll come and stay where I can see you and you won't touch anything and you won't speak to anyone." "What shopping district?" Harry asked, because he was 9 and couldn't always stop himself. Petunia's mouth went thin. "You know perfectly well." He didn't, actually. But something in the way she said it, something tight and almost frightened underneath the usual contempt, made him not push further. He ate his toast, which was the burnt end of the loaf because the unburnt parts were for Dudley, and he thought about London. Dudley wasn't coming. Dudley had a birthday party to attend, some boy from school whose parents had apparently hired an actual magician, which Petunia found quietly offensive for reasons Harry suspected were more complicated than she let on. Vernon was at work. So it was just Petunia and Harry on the train to Paddington, Petunia in her good beige coat sitting with her handbag on her lap like it might try to escape, Harry with his nose against the window watching the city grow up around the tracks. She took him to the Leaky Cauldron. Harry had walked past it before without seeing it, he was almost certain of this. But the moment Petunia gripped his shoulder and steered him toward it, the building simply appeared, slotted between a bookshop and a record store like it had always been there. The sign above the door was old and dark. The pub inside smelled of wood smoke and something underneath that Harry had no name for, something electric and alive. People looked at Petunia. Not rudely, but with a particular recognition, the way you might recognize someone from an old photograph. You know the face but the context is wrong. She didn't look at any of them. She marched straight through and into the courtyard behind, where she tapped the bricks in the wall with what Harry now noticed was a short stick she'd been holding in her closed fist the entire journey, and the wall folded back and the alley opened up. Harry stood very still and looked at all of it. "Come on," Petunia said sharply, but he noticed she didn't pull him. She was watching his face with an expression he'd never seen on her before, complicated, raw, like someone looking at a piece of their own past they'd tried to bury. "This is where my mum was from," Harry said. It wasn't a question. Petunia walked ahead without answering, which was its own kind of answer. Diagon Alley was extraordinary. Harry had lived 9 years in a world of sensible right angles and beige carpets and the particular managed misery of Privet Drive, and here was this place, narrow and ancient and entirely unconcerned with making sense, with owls in the windows and cauldrons stacked outside doors and people walking past in robes like it was perfectly ordinary. A boy about his age was arguing with what appeared to be a self-updating star chart. An old woman was levitating her groceries without appearing to notice she was doing it. Harry catalogued all of it behind his crooked glasses, walking 3 paces behind Petunia, saying nothing. She stopped in front of Gringotts. The bank was enormous and white, marble steps leading up to brass doors guarded by creatures that Harry stared at until Petunia hissed, "Stop staring," at him. He stopped staring but kept looking, which was a skill he had also developed at Privet Drive. The creatures were small, smaller than him, and gray-skinned with long clever fingers and eyes that moved like they were calculating something expensive. Inside was louder than Harry expected. The marble floors threw sound back up, the clicking of those long fingers on counters, the scratch of quills, the clink of gold, the distant rumble of something underground. Long counters ran down either side of the hall, and behind them the creatures, goblins, Harry thought, the words surfacing from some half-remembered story, were attending to a queue of witches and wizards with the air of professionals who found their clientele collectively disappointing. Petunia went to the shortest queue, and Harry stood beside her. He became aware, after a moment, that he was being watched. Not by the witch in the queue in front of them, not by the family behind, by a goblin at the counter to his right who had paused in the middle of stamping a document and was looking at Harry with an expression of sharp, arrested attention. Harry looked back. The goblin, older than the others somehow, or at least giving that impression, with deep-set eyes and a long scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, held his gaze for a long moment. Then he returned to his stamping with every appearance of disinterest. Petunia reached the counter and conducted her business in a low voice, sliding a document across. Harry watched the goblin process it with efficient contempt. The check was small, he could see that much. Petunia's back was very straight and her chin was up, and Harry understood suddenly that she found this humiliating, coming here with her hat and request in hand, cashing whatever quarterly allowance the Potter estate had been sending for his upkeep. She took her coins, put them in her handbag, and turned. Right. We're, Madame Desley. The voice came from behind them. Low, precise, carrying without being raised. The older goblin had come out from behind his counter. This was apparently unusual enough that the witch in the next queue actually stepped back slightly. He stopped a few feet from Harry and looked at him with those calculating eyes. I am Ragnarok, he said. Director of Inheritance and Lineage at Gringotts Wizarding Bank. I wonder if the young Mr. Potter might spare a few minutes. Petunia's handbag grip became white-knuckled. He's 9. Yes, said Ragnarok, as if this was relevant information he had already accounted for. He has no business with a bank. That, said Ragnarok pleasantly, is a matter of some debate. He looked at Harry directly. It's entirely your choice, Mr. Potter. I have noticed something about your magical signature that I think you should be aware of. But you are under no obligation, and your aunt may refuse on your behalf if she wishes, and you'll never hear from me again on the subject. Something about the way he said on the subject, like there was a very large subject being carefully referred to, made Harry's attention sharpen. What kind of something? Harry asked. The kind that requires a private room and a certified inheritance test to explain properly. Is it bad? Ragnarok considered this with apparent seriousness. No. It is, however, significant. Harry looked at Petunia. Petunia was doing the thing she did when she desperately wanted to refuse something but was calculating the consequences of refusal, her eyes slightly unfocused, her jaw working. Whatever she was calculating resolved, unhappily, into a decision. Fine, she said. 15 minutes. Of course, said Ragnarok, and led them both toward a corridor Harry hadn't noticed before. The room was small and clean and smelled of parchment. There was a table with 3 chairs, a lamp that burned gold rather than white, and a cabinet against the wall that Ragnarok opened to produce a shallow stone basin and a small glass vial. Petunia sat with her handbag in her lap again. Harry sat across from her and watched Ragnarok with frank curiosity. An inheritance test, Ragnarok said, setting the basin on the table, is a standard Gringotts procedure for determining the full extent of a witch or wizard's lineage claims. Blood is used because blood carries magical memory more reliably than any other medium. He produced a small silver pin. A single drop from the index finger, Mr. Potter, if you're willing. Harry extended his hand without hesitation. He was used to small hurts. This was nothing. The drop of blood fell into the basin, which was already filled with a clear liquid that Harry thought might be water but behaved like something more interested in what it was touching. It swirled where the blood hit it, and the red spread out in patterns that were too deliberate to be random, and then the liquid began to write. Lines appeared. Words. Names. A family tree that started as a single branch and kept branching until it covered the bottom of the basin and then the walls of the basin, and Harry craned his neck to read it, and Ragnarok made a sound that, for a goblin, was probably the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Petunia said, very quietly, "Oh." Potter, Ragnarok said, more to himself than to either of them, tracing a line with one long finger. He straightened. He opened the cabinet again and removed a large leather-bound ledger. He opened it to a page, then another page, then turned the book sideways. He set it on the table and Harry looked at it. The ledger had columns. Names of houses on the left. Vault numbers in the middle. Balances on the right. Harry read slowly, because some of the handwriting was old and cramped, and because the numbers took a moment to resolve into something he understood as real. House Potter. Primary Vault, Vault 687. Balance, 4,289,041 galleons. He kept reading. House Peveril. Vault 3. Balance, 11,847,293 galleons. House Gryffindor. Vault 1. Balance, 28,404,917 galleons. He looked up. That's a lot of vaults. There are 15 in total, Ragnarok said. You are the last living heir to 15 magical houses, Mr. Potter. The majority have been dormant for several generations, held in trust, accumulating interest, waiting for a rightful claimant. He paused. You are that claimant. 15, Harry repeated. Potter, Peveril, and Gryffindor are the most significant in terms of wealth and political standing. The remaining 12 carry lesser financial weight but include properties, voting seats on the Wizengamot, and hereditary rights that haven't been exercised in over a century. Harry ran his finger down the list of names. Potter. Peveril. Gryffindor. Merlin, he stopped at that one. Merlin. He looked up. Yes, said Ragnarok, who had clearly been waiting for him to reach it. Merlin was real. Very much so, and childless, and quite deliberate about where his estate would eventually pass. Harry sat back in his chair. Outside the small room, Gringotts continued its business, the clicking and the clinking and the distant rumble, and he became aware that he was 9 years old and wearing Dudley's old jumper and his glasses were crooked, and 2 minutes ago he had been standing in a queue with his Aunt Petunia, who had fed him burnt toast for breakfast. He pulled the ledger closer and kept reading. It was on page 7 that he found the anomaly. It wasn't formatted the same as the rest, it was tucked into a subsection titled Authorized Leases and Arrangements, and it was written in the cramped official hand of a bank administrator rather than the older script of the inheritance records. Lessee, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Properties, Godric's Hollow, Lot 4, Potter Estate, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Peveril Gryffindor Joint Estate, the Hog's Head Inn, Potter Estate, 12 additional properties listed in Appendix C, Lease Arrangement, Annual, Auto-Renewing. Rental Fee, 0 galleons. Harry read it twice. Then he said, very calmly, he's been renting my properties for free. Petunia made a noise that might have been a word and might have been something else entirely. Ragnarok sat down across from Harry for the first time. He laced his long fingers together on the table. The lease arrangements were established in November 1981, shortly after your parents' deaths. At the time you had no appointed Gringotts guardian, your parents' appointed heir guardian, Sirius Black, had been incarcerated, and no secondary guardian was named in the will. Dumbledore petitioned the bank as acting chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and a pause that carried real weight, our predecessors at this branch allowed the arrangements under emergency provisions that were, in my professional assessment, not intended to cover situations of this scope or duration. He's not supposed to be renting them at all, Harry said. Not without your approval, no. And not for free under any circumstances. Ragnar's voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. The emergency provisions allow a temporary caretaker arrangement for a maximum of 6 months. These leases have been in place for 8 years. Hogwarts, Harry said. He's the headmaster of a school that's built on my property and he's been paying me nothing. The Hogwarts grounds are jointly owned under the Peveril Gryffindor estate, both of which you now control as sole heir. The school building itself was constructed on Gryffindor land. The lake, the forest, and the outer grounds fall under the Peveril claim. Ragnar met Harry's eyes. Hogwarts, as a physical institution, exists on your property. Petunia stood up. She walked to the wall, looked at it for a moment, and walked back. She sat down again. She said, "Lily," very quietly, and nothing else. Harry thought about Dumbledore. He didn't have a face to put to the name, just the impression of a very old, very important wizard, gleaned from the occasional reference in Petunia's tightened expression whenever the name came up. He thought about Godric's Hollow, where his parents had lived and died and where apparently he had a claim to a lot. What was a lot, exactly? How big was a lot? That had been sitting in someone else's care for 8 years for free. He thought about the vault numbers and the balances. The numbers were so large they didn't feel like money. They felt like something else, something more like possibility, but he was 9 years old and didn't quite have the word for it. What happens now? He asked Ragnar. That depends entirely on you, Mr. Potter. What are my options? Ragnar opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something that Harry would later learn was extraordinary for a goblin. He smiled. Not pleasantly. Admiringly. You are 9 years old. You keep noting that. I keep being surprised by how little it seems to matter. Ragnar folded his hands again. Your options, in brief. 1. You do nothing. The leases remain. Dumbledore continues with his current arrangements. You come back at 11 when the magical world expects you to appear, and by then some of this may have been adjusted. 2. You allow Gringotts to begin the process of formally recognizing your inheritance claims and notifying relevant parties that the emergency provisions have lapsed. 3. You engage Gringotts as your full financial guardian, legally independent of any outside magical authority, and authorize us to begin the inheritance retrieval process on your behalf. What does retrieval mean? It means we begin collecting. A glint in those dark eyes. Back payment on improperly arranged leases. Accounting for assets that have been managed under your name without proper authorization. Recovery of any funds that were diverted from your estate accounts between November 1981 and today. Diverted, Harry said. Like, stolen. That would be for a Wisengamot investigation to determine. Gringotts would simply present the ledgers. Harry looked at the page with Dumbledore's lease arrangements. He looked at the 0 in the rental fee column. He thought about the burnt end of the loaf of bread, the safety pin in his waistband, the Christmases with no presents from anyone except Mrs. Fig next door who gave him cat-themed stationery that she bought in bulk. He thought about Dudley's old clothes and Dudley's old room and the cupboard under the stairs where he slept. He looked at Ragnar and said, Option 3. Petunia inhaled sharply. Harry, it's my money, Harry said. He didn't say it cruelly or loudly. He said it the way you state a fact you've confirmed. It was left to me. These are my houses. He's been using them for free for 8 years while I've been. He stopped. He looked at his aunt. While I was somewhere else. Petunia looked away. Option 3, Harry said again, to Ragnar. The goblin reached into the cabinet and produced 2 thick documents and a quill. Gringotts will require your blood signature, which is legally binding independent of your age for matters of inheritance under the Family Vault Act of 1709. Your aunt will need to sign as witness. I am not, Petunia began. As witness only, Ragnar said. You are not consenting on his behalf. You are merely confirming that you were present and that he was not coerced. A pause. Unless you would prefer we note in the record that you refuse to witness. Petunia took the quill. Harry signed his name first. His blood signature, a drop from the same pricked finger, spread into his signature by the enchanted quill, glowed gold on the parchment for a moment before settling into ordinary black. It looked small, his name. Harry James Potter in the hand of a 9-year-old who'd never had proper handwriting lessons. He thought it would look different once it meant something. Ragnarok took the signed documents, reviewed them, and locked them in the cabinet with a word in gobbledygook. He stood and offered Harry his hand across the table. Harry shook it. Ragnarok's grip was firm and dry and nothing like the reluctant limp handshakes Harry had experienced from his uncle's work associates. "I will assign you a dedicated account manager," Ragnarok said. "Her name is Griphook." "No, that's her assistant. Her name is Ironclaw. She will contact you by letter within the week using a protected OWL service that does not pass through the standard ministry routing." He said ministry routing with a specific flavor of contempt that Harry filed away. "The process will take time. These things always do. But it will move." "Thank you," Harry said. "Don't thank me, Mr. Potter. I am a banker. This is business." But the smile came back for a moment, smaller this time, more genuine for it. "Though I will note, professionally, that it has been some time since I found this work interesting." Outside, Diagon Alley was doing its afternoon business under a sky that had gone from grey to a watery gold. Petunia walked fast with her handbag under her arm and Harry matched her pace easily, 2 steps to her 1, and for a while neither of them said anything. There was a sweet shop on their left with a window full of things that moved. Harry looked at them as they passed. "We should," Petunia began, and then stopped. Started again. "Your mother used to love this street." It came out wrong, like she'd meant to say something else and this was what escaped. "When we were girls. Before." She waved a hand vaguely at the word before and Harry understood it encompassed an entire history he didn't have access to. "She was good at magic?" he asked. Petunia walked half a block before she answered. "She was extraordinary," she said flatly, and there was grief in it and resentment and a love so complicated it had curdled into something unrecognizable over 20 years of determined distance. Harry thought about the basin with the blood in it and the name spreading across the bottom like roots. Lily Evans, who became Lily Potter, who was the last of a line that stretched back to Godric Gryffindor and Ignotus Peverell and further than that, further than Harry could properly imagine, all the way to a name that was more legend than history. She had died at 21 and left him 15 houses. He thought that was the saddest sentence he'd ever assembled. They were passing Gringotts again on their way back through the alley and Harry stopped on the steps, just for a moment, and looked up at the building. The goblins at the doors regarded him with their calculating eyes. "What?" Petunia said sharply. "Nothing," Harry said, and kept walking. But he was thinking about Hogwarts, a school built on his property, where presumably he was expected to arrive in 2 years as an ordinary student, uniformed and wide-eyed and properly grateful for the opportunity. He found he had some thoughts about that. The train back was quieter than the one going. Petunia sat with her hands in her lap instead of strangling her handbag, which was different. The countryside unreeled outside the window and Harry watched it and thought in the methodical way he'd developed for problems that mattered. He knew the important things now. Not everything, there were clearly entire systems of this he didn't understand, political structures and legal frameworks and apparently a parliament called the Wisengamot where he held voting seats he didn't know existed. He didn't understand what made one magical house more powerful than another, or what hereditary rights actually meant in practice, or why Dumbledore had needed to lease 12 additional properties listed in Appendix C when he was already headmaster of a school with grounds the size of a small estate. Those were things he could learn. What he knew was simpler and more important. Money that belonged to him had been inaccessible for 8 years. Property that was his had been used without permission or payment. And someone very powerful and very respected had arranged things that way, and nobody had questioned it, because nobody had checked. He was 9. He was a year away from double digits. He wore a safety pin in his waistband and slept in a cupboard and had never in his living memory had a birthday cake. And somewhere in a marble bank with brass doors, a goblin named Ragnok had put 2 signed documents in a cabinet and locked them with a word Harry hadn't understood, and the locked door was his. He thought about what Ragnok had said, "I keep being surprised by how little it seems to matter." Harry pressed his nose against the train window and watched the city give way to suburbs give way to the small ordered greenery of Surrey, and he thought, he'd spent 9 years being invisible in the Dursley household. He'd been good at it because he'd had no choice. But invisible had never been what he was. It had only been what he was required to be. He had 15 names now, written in his own blood in a basin in Gringotts. He thought that was probably enough to get started. Back at Privet Drive, Vernon's car was in the driveway. Harry followed Petunia inside and went straight to his cupboard because the routine was the routine, but he stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The cupboard door had a latch that he knew stuck in damp weather and a crack in the lower panel where the wood had warped and a smell of old sports equipment that no amount of leaving it open had ever cleared. He looked at it for a long moment. He picked up his school bag from where he'd left it by the door that morning. He took out his exercise book, the spare one, not the school one, and a biro. He sat down on the bottom step of the stairs, which was harder than it should have been and smelled of carpet cleaner, and he wrote at the top of a clean page, "Things to find out." He wrote for 20 minutes while the sounds of Vernon's television and Dudley's gaming system came through the walls. He wrote until he had 3 pages of questions in his small, clear handwriting, organized roughly by category: financial, legal, political, historical. He drew lines between things that seemed connected. He put a star beside the ones that felt most urgent. At the top of the page, underlined twice, he'd written, Appendix C, what are the 12 other properties? And at the bottom, circled, a single question: what did Dumbledore think he was doing? Not angry. Genuinely curious. Because the thing about people who did large complicated things that served their own interests was that they always had a reason. And understanding the reason was the only way to understand the shape of the problem. He closed the notebook, put it back in his bag, and thought about going to bed. Then he thought about the vault balances written in cramped official script. 28,404,917 galleons in the Gryffindor vault alone. He didn't know the exchange rate between galleons and pound sterling, but he knew it was significant because even Petunia had said "oh" in that specific tone. He thought about Hogwarts, marble and towers and a roof that apparently, he'd read this in a book from the school library, showed the actual night sky. A school on his land. Teachers paid, presumably, with fees generated by a student body that attended a school on his land. He was going there in 2 years. He would arrive knowing exactly what he owned and exactly what had been taken, and he would look at Albus Dumbledore across the length of whatever room the great headmaster preferred for his important meetings, and they would both know what the other knew. Harry found he was looking forward to that. He put the notebook safely away, took off his crooked glasses, and pulled the cupboard door open. He could hear Dudley upstairs demanding snacks. He could hear Vernon's laugh at something on the television, the particular satisfied sound of a man who believed the walls of his life were exactly as solid as they appeared. Harry curled up in his too small cot in his too small cupboard and closed his eyes, and the last thing he thought before he slept was not about injustice or anger or the cold arithmetic of 8 years of stolen property. He thought, 15. 15 houses. 15 vault rooms full of centuries of accumulated wealth and history and power. 15 seals waiting to be claimed by someone who had the right blood and the right signature and, as Ragnok had noted with what passed for goblin amusement, what appeared to be the right disposition for the work. 9 years old and small and sleeping in a cupboard. But the cupboard was temporary. Everything about this was temporary. He slept well, for the first time in as long as he could remember. 3 days later, a small, precise brown owl landed on the windowsill of number 4, Privet Drive, early enough that Vernon was still at breakfast and Petunia was still in her dressing gown. It carried a slim envelope sealed with the Gringotts crest, a key inside AG, embossed in dark red wax, addressed in formal script to Lord Harry James Potter, heir to the most ancient and noble houses. Petunia saw it from the kitchen doorway. She stood very still for a moment. Harry came downstairs for his morning chores, saw the envelope on the windowsill where Petunia had left it without comment, and picked it up. He read his name on the front. He turned it over and looked at the seal. Lord. He broke the wax carefully, unfolded the letter inside, and read it standing in the hallway in his socked feet while Dudley thundered past him demanding the bathroom. The letter was from Ironclaw. It was precise, professional, and 3 pages long, and it outlined the initial steps Gringotts had already begun on his behalf, a formal audit of the Potter estate accounts from 1981 to present, a legal notice to relevant parties that emergency provisions had lapsed, and a request that Harry review and confirm the list of properties in. Harry's mouth curved at the bottom of the second page, Appendix C. He carried the letter back to his cupboard and read all 3 pages twice. In the kitchen, he could hear Petunia filling the kettle. Vernon was talking about a man at his work who'd done something stupid. The television was on in the living room even though nobody was watching it, because it was always on, a constant low hum of ordinary life arranged very carefully around the extraordinary thing it was trying to contain. Harry folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into the inside cover of his exercise book. Then he went to make breakfast, which was his job, which had always been his job, and he made it without complaint, and he set the table, and he sat at the corner where he always sat, and he ate what was left without being told to be grateful for it. But his back was straighter than it had been on Monday. And Petunia, cracking eggs into the frying pan with her back to the room, noticed. She didn't say anything. She didn't turn around. But she noticed, and Harry could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had, and that she understood what it meant. Lily's boy had found out what he was. And now they were all going to have to figure out what to do about it. Chapter 2, 15 Seals. The audit took 6 weeks. Harry knew this because Ironclaw's letters came every Thursday, each one slightly thicker than the last, each one written in the same precise hand with the same economical language that managed to convey an enormous amount of information in very few words. He liked Ironclaw without having met her. He liked the way she wrote "We have identified and the following discrepancies and pending your authorization," language that treated him as the person making decisions rather than the person being managed. He kept the letters in a locked tin he'd found in the Desley garage, underneath a broken lawnmower that nobody had used in 3 years. The lock was a small thing, a cheap hardware store padlock, but he'd also cast, and this still surprised him, the way it kept working, the way it came out of him like breathing, a small sticking charm that kept the tin from being moved. He hadn't known he could do that until he tried. The tin sat under the broken lawnmower and nobody went near the broken lawnmower, and Harry's correspondence was safe. The letters were teaching him things. He was learning, for instance, that the Potter estate had been making quarterly payments for his upkeep to the Desley household, 250 galleons per quarter, converted to sterling at the prevailing exchange rate, which worked out to roughly £1,200 every 3 months. He was learning that these payments had been authorized by Dumbledore, from Harry's own accounts, without any corresponding adjustment to how Harry was actually being treated at number 4, Privet Drive. He was learning what the 12 properties in Appendix C were. They included a townhouse in Edinburgh that was being used by the Hogwarts governors for their quarterly meetings. 3 cottages in Hogsmeade, 2 of which were rented to private tenants who were, as far as Harry could tell, paying rent to a management company that had been set up by the Dumbledore-authorized estate caretaker in 1982 and whose income had been flowing into a separate discretionary account rather than Harry's vaults. A warehouse near Diagon Alley. A manor in Wiltshire that appeared to have been used for ministry storage for 5 years in the early 90s without a storage agreement ever being signed. And the property that Harry spent the most time thinking about, a small island off the Scottish coast with a lighthouse, listed in the Potter records as Salas Beag, which translated from Gaelic as Little Light, which had apparently been a Potter family retreat for 200 years. He would go there someday. He decided this looking at the property description in Ironclaw's letter, reading the dimensions and the recorded magical wards, still active, she noted, functioning at full capacity, and the description of the library in the lighthouse which contained, among other things, an uncatalogued collection of handwritten Potter family grimoires. Grimoires. His family had grimoires. Plural. He wrote back to Ironclaw with the same economy she used herself. Please confirm all Appendix C properties. Initiate rent recovery for the Hogsmeade cottages from the discretionary account. What authorization would I need to access Salas Beag before age 17? Her response came the following Thursday, regarding Salas Beag, as registered Lord of the Potter Estate, you have immediate access rights regardless of magical age. We can arrange transport via Gringotts authorized port key at your convenience. He read that sitting on the garden wall at Privet Drive while Dudley and his friends played some kind of game that involved a football and gradually escalating violence. The garden wall was technically in Vernon's sightline from the kitchen window but far enough from Dudley's radius of interest to be effectively private. At your convenience. 3 words that had never previously applied to his life. He wrote back, not yet. Finish the audit first. The audit results came in a document thick enough that Ironclaw sent it via a different owl, a larger one, dark grey, that landed on the garden wall with evident dignity and extended its leg with the air of a professional who had delivered important things before and found the work satisfying. Harry read the summary 3 times and the full document once, slowly, on a Sunday afternoon when the Dursleys had gone to visit a neighbor and the house was quiet. The numbers were not a surprise, exactly, because the letters had been building toward them. But seeing them consolidated was different. In 8 years, the Potter estate accounts had seen unexplained withdrawals totaling 63,000 galleons. These were categorized in the audit as disbursements for Harry Potter's maintenance and welfare and authorized by Dumbledore's caretaker arrangement. There was no itemized accounting of what the maintenance and welfare had consisted of. There was no record of the money reaching any vendor or service that would indicate it had been spent on Harry specifically. There was only the authorization and the withdrawal. Harry thought about his crooked glasses and his cupboard and his safety pin. He put the document down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. Not angry, he kept checking himself for anger and finding something cooler and more useful underneath it. More like, confirmed. More like, now I know the shape of it. He picked up his pen and his spare exercise book and he wrote, carefully, this is what happened. This is what can be proven. This is what I want done about it. He spent 2 hours on that page and came out with something that was, in retrospect, more or less a legal brief, written by a 9-year-old in a Surrey kitchen in Dudley's spare exercise book, but coherent and specific and, when he sent a version of it to Ironclaw with his next letter, apparently impressive enough that she forwarded it to the Gringotts legal team with a note that Harry would only read much later, he's 9 years old. Use him carefully. It was the 2nd week of September when Dumbledore came to Privet Drive. Harry was in the garden. He was supposed to be weeding but he'd finished the weeding and moved on to a more interesting project, which was attempting to coax the small, scraggly rosebush against the back fence into better health through a combination of careful pruning and the kind of concentrated attention that he discovered sometimes resulted in things quietly improving. He had no official framework for what he was doing. It wasn't a spell, exactly. It was more like, persuasion. He heard the front gate open. He heard Petunia's sharp footsteps to the door, her "good afternoon," that came out the same way it always did when she was talking to someone she found significant and frightening in equal measure, controlled, surface smooth, deeply reluctant. And then a voice he'd never heard before said, "Petunia, how well you look," in the sort of way that meant the speaker had no real opinion on the subject and was simply depositing pleasantry in the appropriate slot. Harry stood up and brushed dirt off his knees. He went in through the back door. The man in the Dursley sitting room was very tall and very old, with long silver hair and a silver beard and half-moon spectacles and robes of a deep blue that moved like water when he turned. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome a long time ago and was now distinguished instead, which was better in some ways and more complicated in others. He looked like someone who had been the most important person in many rooms for so long that being the most important person in a room was simply the ambient condition of his existence. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was warm and careful and practiced, the expression of someone who had thought about this moment and prepared for it. "Harry," he said. "My name is Albus Dumbledore. I am the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where your mother and father studied, and where I very much hope you will study in 2 years' time. I know who you are, Harry said. Something shifted in Dumbledore's eyes. Do you? I suppose your aunt may have mentioned, Gringotts mentioned you, Harry said. Quite a lot, actually. The room went still. Petunia had positioned herself near the door to the hallway in the particular way she stood when she wanted to be near an exit. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, exactly, but the quality of his attention shifted, became less warm and more precise, like a lens refocusing. Ah, he said. Do you want to sit down? Harry asked, because he was still a child and the etiquette of the thing required the offer, and because he wanted to see how Dumbledore handled being offered hospitality in what was, technically, a property arrangement that Dumbledore had been managing for him without his knowledge or consent. Dumbledore sat on the sofa. Harry sat in the armchair across from him, Vernon's armchair, the one Harry was normally never allowed to use, and put his feet flat on the floor and waited. How much, Dumbledore said carefully, has Gringotts told you? The inheritance. The houses. The audit. Harry paused. The leases. I see. Dumbledore removed his spectacles and cleaned them with the corner of his robe, which Harry recognized as a thinking gesture disguised as a practical one. Harry, I want to be very straightforward with you. The arrangements I made in 1981 were made under extraordinary circumstances, in a time of great fear and confusion, with the intention of protecting both the Potter estate and, most importantly, you. By moving into my properties for free. By ensuring the properties were maintained and not exploited by individuals who might not have your best interests at heart. You moved into them for free, Harry said again. The financial arrangements were complex. Ragnarok said they weren't complex at all. He said they were straightforward and wrong. Dumbledore put his spectacles back on. He looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than the warm practiced one he'd come in wearing. Ragnarok has his own motivations in this matter, Harry. The goblins have long had grievances with the human magical community, and, I know about Ragnarok's motivations, Harry said. He told me himself. He wants the precedent. If Gringotts can prove that emergency provisions were misused by the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, it changes the legal framework around estate management in cases where there's no magical guardian. That's good for goblins because it limits human authority over unclaimed vaults. I get that. He kept his voice even. It doesn't mean he's wrong about the numbers. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car went past. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The ordinary sounds of Privet Drive going about its ordinary business, utterly unaware of what was happening in the sitting room of number 4. You are, Dumbledore said finally, quite remarkable. I'm 9, Harry said, which was the least useful response but came out anyway. Yes. And something moved through Dumbledore's face that Harry couldn't entirely categorize. It might have been regret. May I ask what you intend to do? Gringotts is already doing it. The audit. Yes. I expected that. He folded his hands in his lap. Harry, I want you to understand that I have spent the last 8 years working to ensure your safety. The reason you are here, with your aunt, rather than in the wizarding world, there are threats you don't yet know about. Threats that specifically target you. Voldemort, Harry said. Petunia made a faint sound from the doorway. Dumbledore's eyebrows rose fractionally. You know that name. I've had 6 weeks of nothing to do except read everything Ironclaw sent me. The Potter family history is in the Gringotts records. Harry met his eyes. I know what happened to my parents. I know why. I know about the prophecy, the one you know about but apparently decided other people didn't need to. He watched Dumbledore's face carefully. I know quite a lot, Professor. The title came out with a slight edge Harry hadn't entirely intended. He filed that away as something to manage better in future. Dumbledore unfolded his hands and refolded them. The prophecy is a matter I had hoped to discuss with you at a more appropriate. When would be appropriate? When I'm 11 and on your property and enrolled in your school and entirely within the systems you manage. Harry's voice stayed level. This was important. He wasn't angry at Dumbledore. He was genuinely asking. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm asking when you thought the right time was. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. When you were older. When you understood more. I understand enough, Harry said. Someone wants to kill me. They killed my parents. You know more about why than I do, and you've been deciding what I should and shouldn't know about my own situation. I'm not, he stopped, recalibrated, I'm not angry about the leases, exactly. I think it was wrong and I think Gringotts is right to pursue it. But what I actually want to know is why. He leaned forward slightly in Vernon's armchair. Why did you set it up this way? You're not poor. You're the headmaster of a school. You didn't need the properties. So why arrange it so you controlled them? The question landed. Harry could see it landing, could see the way Dumbledore's face did something complicated and quiet. Because, Dumbledore said, after a pause that felt genuinely considered rather than performed, I did not know when or whether Voldemort would return. And if he did return, the assets and resources of the most powerful family lines in British magical history would be strategically significant. I did not want them available to interests that might not be yours, Harry said. That might not be dedicated to fighting him. But they're not yours either way. They're mine. Dumbledore looked at him and for the first time in the conversation something in his expression was simply tired. Yes, he said. They are yours. And the 63,000 galleons. A pause. Administered for your welfare. With no accounting. The records were, there are no records, Harry said, because Gringotts looked for them and they don't exist. He wasn't accusing. He was reporting. I'd like them back. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. I will speak with my solicitors, Dumbledore said. My solicitors are goblins. They're very good at this. Harry stood up, because the conversation felt finished in the way conversations did when the important thing had been said. I'll be at Hogwarts in 2 years, Professor. I'm looking forward to it. He meant it, which was perhaps the strangest part. I think it's a good school. I think you probably run it very well. He let that sit for a moment before adding, I'll be coming as a student, though. Not as a charity case. Dumbledore rose. He was very tall standing, and the blue of his robes caught the afternoon light through the net curtains, and he looked for a moment like something ancient and genuinely formidable, which Harry took note of because it was true and it mattered. Harry, he said. Whatever happens with the estate, whatever Gringotts recovers, I need you to understand that Hogwarts is safe. The wards I've placed are on my property, Harry said, pleasantly. I'll review the ward schema before September. Iron Claw says the Gryffindor estate records include the original ward documentation from the founders' period. I want to know what's mine before I walk in. He paused. I'll probably keep most of them. Dumbledore, for the first time in the conversation, had nothing immediate to say. He left 10 minutes later, having exchanged pleasantries with Petunia that were even more hollow than the ones he'd arrived with, and the sound of the front gate closing behind him was very clean and final in the quiet afternoon. Petunia came into the sitting room and looked at Harry. He was still standing in the middle of the room, not having moved since Dumbledore left. You're going to make enemies, she said. He's not an enemy. You were, she gestured at where Dumbledore had been sitting. He's the most powerful wizard in Britain. You're 9 years old and you spoke to him like he owed you an explanation. He did. Petunia sat down heavily on the sofa in the spot Dumbledore had just vacated. She looked at her hands. Lily would have, she stopped. What? She would have done exactly the same thing, Petunia said, quietly, and went to put the kettle on. Autumn turned into winter and winter turned into another year, and Harry learned. He learned from Ironclaw's letters, which grew more detailed as the audit moved from summary to specifics to legal action. He learned from the books he ordered through Gringotts. Ironclaw had established him a small discretionary account, separate from the primary vaults, accessible through a postal arrangement that bypassed the owl routing the ministry apparently monitored, books on wizarding law and estate management and the history of the great magical houses. He learned from the grimoires. The first grimoire arrived in March, carefully packaged in waxed cloth and spelled for stability in transit. It was from Salas Beeg, a Potter family grimoire dating to the 1600s, written in the cramped hand of a James Potter 4 generations removed, covering everything from basic warming charms to a proprietary approach to defensive warding that the author called layered intent, which Harry spent 3 weeks working through the theory of before he tried anything practical. He was careful about the practical. He was 9, then 10, and his magic was reliable in the way that water was reliable. It went where it was supposed to go, mostly, but it was always stronger than expected and sometimes surprised him. The warming charm he'd learned from the grimoire came out the first time as a localized heat source that was closer to a small fire than a gentle warmth, and he'd had to damp it down quickly with the mental equivalent of turning a faucet. He thought a lot about that. About the gap between what he intended and what came out. It wasn't lack of control, the control was there, the sense of the magic responding to his intent. It was more like the intent kept being larger than he'd meant it to be. Like asking someone to pour you a glass of water and they filled a bathtub and stood back looking pleased with themselves. He worked on it quietly in his room. He had a room now, Dudley's second bedroom, because Petunia had moved him without explanation one evening in November, had simply left clean linens on the bed and said nothing about it, and Harry had slept in an actual bed for the first time in memory and woken up feeling like something had shifted in the foundations of the world. He worked on small magics, precise ones, lighting and extinguishing candles, strengthening the old latch on his window, the rosebush in the garden which was now doing extremely well and had bewildered Vernon into 3 separate conversations about fertilizer brands he hadn't actually changed. The second grimoire arrived in June. It was older, 1400s, probably, written in a blend of English and Latin, and it had a section on Lord-level magic that Harry read very carefully and then read again. Lord-level magic was not a separate category, the grimoire explained, in the patient way old texts sometimes had, like they'd written for someone who needed things explained and weren't embarrassed about it. It was the same magic, accessed through a different relationship. An ordinary witch or wizard accessed their magic through intent and training, through wand-mediated focus. A lord of an ancient house accessed their magic additionally through claim, through the resonance between their bloodline and the properties, wards, and magical artifacts under their stewardship. The magic of the estate became, in a real sense, available to them. Not unlimited. Not without cost. But augmented in ways that grew with the strength and number of claims held. 15 claims, the grimoire did not say, but Harry's arithmetic did. He sat with that for a while. He wasn't reckless about it. He didn't go outside and set things on fire to see how large the fire would get. He sat with it the way he sat with the audit numbers and the lease documents, turning it over carefully, understanding what it meant before deciding what to do with it. What it meant, as far as he could tell, was this: in 2 years he was going to walk into a school on his own land, carrying the accumulated magical legacy of 15 ancient houses, having spent 2 years working quietly with the best financial minds in the wizarding world to reclaim what was his, knowing more about the estate of the British magical world than most adults twice his age. He was going to sit in classes and learn spells from textbooks. He was, he decided, going to learn them very well. The letter from Ironclaw in September of his 10th year contained a development he hadn't anticipated. The Wisengamot had been notified. Not of everything, not yet, but of the lapse in emergency provisions and the initiation of an audit. This was, apparently, procedurally required once the Gringotts legal team filed the formal notice of inheritance claim. The Wisengamot's records office had to update their rolls to reflect active claimants. The result was that somewhere in the British magical government, Harry's name had been entered in the active rolls for 15 houses, including 3 that carried hereditary Wisengamot seats. He was 9-10 now, as of the 31st of July, and he had 3 seats in the British Magical Parliament. He could not exercise them until he was 15 and formally took up his lord's rings, which were stored in the Gringotts high-security vaults and could not be accessed before then without a full Wisengamot vote. But they were there. 3 seats. 3 votes. Just, waiting. He wrote to Ironclaw, "What happens to the seats in the meantime? Are they counted as absent or filled by a proxy?" Ironclaw's response, currently listed as vacant. Vacant seats are counted as abstentions in votes, which in practice serves the interests of the majority at any given time. It has been noted by this office that Lord Potter's 3 vacant seats have, on several occasions in the past decade, represented the deciding margin in Wisengamot votes. Harry read this paragraph 3 times. He looked at the ceiling of his actual bedroom with its actual bed and actual window that looked out onto the Desley garden where the rosebush was still thriving. He thought, someone has been counting on those absences. He wrote back, "Can an underage heir appoint a proxy for vacant seats? And if so, who is legally qualified to serve?" The answer came the following Thursday. Under the Family Representation Act of 1823, an heir who has formally initiated an inheritance claim may appoint a Gringotts-approved proxy for hereditary seats until such time as they take up the rings personally. Qualification requirements are outlined in Appendix D of the enclosed document. There was an Appendix D. Harry read Appendix D. He read it carefully. He thought about the names on the qualification list, the criteria for a Gringotts-approved proxy. He thought about who he knew, which at this point was mostly Ironclaw and Ragnarok and, peripherally, Petunia, and this was a problem he filed under things that require fixing before Hogwarts. He needed people. Real ones, people who understood the wizarding world from the inside and had both the qualification and the interest to serve. He needed them and he didn't have them yet. This was the one thing the grimoires couldn't give him. He wrote to Ironclaw, "I'll think about the proxy question. In the meantime, is there anything I can do about the Hogsmeade properties? Specifically, is there a legal basis for me to renegotiate the existing private tenant arrangements now that the discretionary account has been frozen?" The answer was yes. He spent 3 evenings reading through the rental history of the 2 occupied Hogsmeade cottages, one leased to a retired potions merchant named Claudius Vane and one to a younger couple, the Abernethys, who had apparently been renting it well below market rate because the discretionary account manager had been taking the difference, and drafted what Ironclaw later told him was a legally sound renegotiation proposal. Not a rent increase. Harry wasn't interested in wringing more money out of people who didn't know their landlord had changed. He wanted a transparent arrangement, a formal contract with his name on it, the Gringotts crest as guarantor, and a clear record that he was aware of and consenting to the existing terms. He wanted the paper trail. He wanted his name on things. Ironclaw's response to this proposal, executed. Contract sent to tenants. Both have responded positively. Claudius Vane has sent an enclosed letter for you. The enclosed letter was on heavy cream paper with an old-fashioned seal and said, in a firm elderly hand, "I understand from Gringotts that I have been renting from you, Lord Potter, for 6 years without your knowledge. I wish to express my apologies for any inconvenience this has caused, my gratitude for the reasonable terms, and, if I may be so bold, my admiration for a 10-year-old who has apparently sorted out more of the Gringotts mess in 6 months than the Ministry has managed in a decade. If you should ever want advice on wizarding retail commerce or simply a decent cup of tea in Hogsmeade, my door is open. C. Vane." Harry read this letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it with the grimoires rather than with the legal documents. His first piece of correspondence from someone who seemed to like him for himself rather than for what he represented. He thought that probably mattered. The night before his Hogwarts letter was supposed to arrive, he'd calculated the date from the Gringotts records, which included copies of his parents' Hogwarts correspondence. He sat on his windowsill and looked at the street and thought about the year ahead. Ironclaw had sent what she called a pre-enrollment brief, which was a 20-page document covering everything from the legal status of the Hogwarts lease to a summary of current school staff and their relationship to the Potter estate to a note, diplomatically worded but clear, that Dumbledore had not yet returned the 63,000 galleons. Discussions were ongoing. Harry had a fairly clear idea of what ongoing meant. He also had a fairly clear idea that Dumbledore was not a dishonest man, not really, not in his bones, but a man who had made decisions with someone else's resources and then constructed, over years, a framework in which those decisions were justified and necessary, and dismantling that framework brick by brick while admitting you'd built it wrong was something that required more than 6 months of correspondence. He wasn't in a hurry. He was going to be at Hogwarts for 7 years. He had time. What he was in a hurry about was smaller and more personal. He wanted to learn magic. Real magic, from real teachers, in a real school with real other students who knew what they were and what the world was and could have conversations that didn't require him to pretend. He wanted to fly. The broomstick entry in the Hogwarts correspondence made his chest do something complicated with anticipation. He wanted to find out what house he'd be sorted into, though he had a suspicion that the sorting hat, if it had any familiarity with the founder's bloodlines, was going to have an interesting experience sorting the heir of Gryffindor. He wanted, and this was the one that surprised him most when he let himself think it, he wanted friends. Real ones. People who would know what he actually was and sit with him anyway. People who would come to know him from the inside rather than from the reports. He'd been lonely for 10 years and he was good at not noticing it, but it was still there, a low background hum of absence that the letters and the grimoires and the rosebush hadn't quite addressed. He was going to fix that too. He was discovering, quite good at fixing things. The morning came grey and soft, and the owl arrived with his letter before Vernon was even downstairs for breakfast, a heavy cream envelope with a purple seal and handwriting that he recognized, from the parents' correspondence in the Gringotts records, as McGonagall's. He opened it neatly at the kitchen table and read it while the kettle boiled. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He set it down on the table and he smiled, small and real, the way he smiled when something went according to a plan he'd been patient about. He picked it up again and read the supply list. He had opinions about some of the textbook choices. He would keep them to himself, for now. Petunia came downstairs and saw him at the table with the Hogwarts letter open in front of him, and she went to the kettle and poured her tea, and they sat in the kitchen without talking, which was their way, and it was comfortable in the way that things between them had slowly, quietly become comfortable over 2 years of a peculiar and uncategorizable arrangement. She put a plate of toast in front of him. Unburnt. She'd been doing that since November of his first year with the letters. She'd never mentioned it and neither had he. He ate his toast and thought about Diagon Alley and the list of supplies and the vault that Ironclaw had confirmed would have a standard access key waiting for him, not a full vault access, just the everyday account she'd set up for school expenses, separate from the main inheritance accounts. He thought about what it would feel like to walk into Gringotts as a customer rather than as a 9-year-old in a too-big jumper standing in a queue. He found out 2 weeks later, when Petunia drove him to London and they walked through the leaky cauldron and into Diagon Alley. He walked up the marble steps and through the brass doors, and the goblins at the door watched him with their calculating eyes, and Harry looked back and said, "Good morning," in a natural way, and one of them, the taller one, gave a small, deliberate nod that was different from anything he'd seen a goblin direct at a human customer before. He went to the counter and gave his name. The goblin at the counter looked it up in the book and went still for just a moment, not long, not dramatic, just the smallest pause of recognition, and then said, "1 moment, Lord Potter," and sent a message down the line that resulted, 30 seconds later, in Ironclaw appearing from a side corridor. She was shorter than Ragnarok, with sharp dark eyes and fingers that were always moving slightly, like she was calculating something at rest. She looked Harry up and down with frank assessment. "You write shorter letters than I expected," she said. "You write efficient ones," Harry said. "I was matching the register." She gestured toward the corridor. "Your everyday vault key is prepared. Would you like a brief tour, or do you have a supply list to get through?" "Supply list today." Tour another time. He paused. Thank you, Ironclaw. For all of it. The year of letters. She regarded him. It's work, she said. And you make it easy. You ask good questions and you don't waste time being surprised by the answers. She held out the small brass key. Though I'll note for the record that the Claudius Vane letter was not efficient. No, Harry agreed, taking the key. It wasn't. He thought he saw the edge of something in her expression, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. He walked out of Gringotts into the mid-morning alley with a vault key in his pocket and a school list in his hand, and he bought his books and his cauldron and his robes. He stood in Madame Malkin's and let himself be measured properly, for the first time in his life wearing something that fit, and he spent 20 minutes in Ollivander's, which was a peculiar and absorbing experience that ended with a wand of holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, which Mr. Ollivander called curious in a tone that suggested he had opinions he was carefully not sharing. He carried it out into the alley and felt the warmth of it in his hand, the particular sense of resonance between something he'd been and something he was about to become. The wand hummed faintly. He was nearly sure he wasn't imagining it. He met Petunia at the Leaky Cauldron entrance, where she'd been waiting on the street outside. She wouldn't go back in, not today, maybe not ever, and she looked at the bags and the wand box and something moved through her face that Harry couldn't name. Ready? She said. Yes, said Harry. He had been ready for 2 years. He was ready now. Chapter 3, The Express and the Empty Seat. King's Cross was exactly as chaotic as Harry had expected and exactly as ordinary, which was the point. The whole genius of the hidden platform was that the ordinary chaos of a working train station made the extraordinary entirely invisible. Families rushed past with trolleys. Pigeons argued in the rafters. A PA system announced a delay to Edinburgh in the bored voice of someone who had announced delays to Edinburgh many times before. Harry moved through it with his trolley at an even pace, Owlcage balanced on top of his trunk, watching for the pillar between platforms 9 and 10 with the same focused attention he'd given everything wizarding adjacent since that Tuesday in July 2 years ago. He found it without difficulty. He checked that nobody non-magical was paying attention. Nobody was, they were all dealing with their own delays and their own luggage, and walked through at a steady walk, not running, because running implied uncertainty and he wasn't uncertain. The Hogwarts Express was red and enormous and steaming in a way that suggested magic rather than mechanics, and the platform was full of families in various states of tearful farewell. Harry stood for a moment and just looked at it. Not because he was overwhelmed, though there was something in his chest that was warm and complicated. Because this was the first time he'd seen it and he wanted to see it properly. He loaded his trunk, settled his owl, Ptolemy, a small tawny he'd bought in Diagon Alley under the logic that owls were useful and this one had looked at him with particular intelligence, into the luggage rack, and found a compartment near the middle of the train. He sat on the left side, facing the direction of travel, and watched the platform through the window. Families. Everywhere, families. Mothers straightening robes and fathers giving awkward manly nods and siblings waving and one small girl who had apparently decided that weeping openly was the appropriate response to her brother leaving for school. Harry watched all of it with the specific quality of attention he developed for things he had no personal comparison point for. He didn't feel sad about it. He'd decided, sometime in the past 2 years, that the shape of his family was unusual but not empty. He had Ironclaw, who was professional and exacting and had sent him a book on Wisengamot procedure for his birthday that was the best present he'd ever received. He had Claudius Vane's open door in Hogsmeade. He had Ragnarok, who occasionally appended a single line of personal commentary to official documents. Things like this provision has annoyed goblins for 400 years, you should challenge it, which Harry counted as warmth, all things considered. He had Petunia, who had driven him to King's Cross this morning without comment and then, at the barrier, had done something he hadn't expected. She'd put her hand briefly on top of his head, just for a moment, awkward and strange and clearly unrehearsed, and then said, "Right, off you go," in a voice that was slightly thicker than usual, and turned and walked away before he could react. He hadn't reacted, because she clearly needed him not to. But he thought about it now on the train, watching the platform, and found it was in the category of things that mattered. The train began to fill. He heard compartment doors opening and closing, the escalating volume of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. Nobody came to his compartment for the first 10 minutes, and then the door slid open and a girl looked in with large eyes and bushy brown hair and a book under each arm. "Can I sit here?" "Everything else is." She glanced back down the corridor, boys doing something with a firework, which I assume is the kind of thing that happens on this train and will continue to happen, but I'd rather not be adjacent to it. Harry gestured at the seats opposite. "Please." She sat down, arranged her books, and looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who had decided that social pleasantries were fine but efficiency was better. "I'm Hermione Granger. I'm Muggle-born, which means I only found out about all of this 2 months ago, which means I've been reading everything I can since then." "Have you read A History of Magic?" "Twice," Harry said. "The whole thing?" "It's very long but the footnotes are good." Her eyes lit up in the way that people's eyes lit up when they found someone unexpected. "They're excellent. The original source is Bathilda Bagshot used in the early chapters. I went and tried to find the primary texts and 2 of them don't seem to exist in any library I can access, which makes me think there's a wizarding archive system separate from what she cites and." She stopped. "Sorry. I do that." "Don't stop on my account," Harry said. "There is a separate archive. The Gringotts estate records have documents going back to the 10th century that aren't anywhere in the published literature." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I've been using them for 2 years. She processed this. "You're from a wizarding family?" "Yes and no." He considered how much to say, decided that Hermione Granger had, in approximately 45 seconds, given every indication of being the kind of person who handled information well and wasted nothing. "My family is old wizarding but I grew up Muggle. I found out about the magical world at 9. Same as me, essentially." She tilted her head. "But you've had access to Gringotts records for 2 years. That's not standard, is it?" "No." She waited to see if he'd say more. When he didn't immediately, she accepted it without pressing, which moved her significantly up his assessment scale. "I'm Hermione Granger," she said again, as if restarting. "What's your name?" "Harry Potter." The change in her face was immediate: recognition, recalibration, the rapid behind-the-eyes processing of someone updating a large amount of filed information. "The Harry Potter. There's only one, as far as I know. You defeated you-know-who when you were a baby." "Something happened when I was a baby that stopped him, yes. I'm not sure I should get credit for surviving something I didn't choose." She considered this with genuine seriousness. "That's a fair distinction." She looked at his forehead, where the fringe fell over the scar. "Does it hurt?" "Not regularly. Sometimes when I'm tired." He looked at her steadily. "I'd rather you didn't mention it to other people on the train." "Obviously," she said, as if this was the least he could ask. She opened one of her books, the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, and then closed it again. "Can I ask, the Gringotts records? The primary sources from before the 10th century. Do they talked for 2 hours." Hermione Granger, Harry discovered, had read every book on the Hogwarts list 3 times and several that weren't on the list but were adjacent to subjects on the list, and she had the particular quality of mind that didn't just memorize things but interrogated them. She'd find a fact in one book and immediately look for the fact that contradicted it and work out why the contradiction existed. She was occasionally overbearing about what she knew and occasionally uncertain about things she thought she should know better, and she spoke very fast and then apologized for speaking very fast and then did it again. He liked her immediately and completely. They were somewhere in the Midlands when the compartment door opened again and a round-faced boy looked in with the expression of someone who had been experiencing a difficult morning and expected it to continue. He had dirt on his knee and something that might have been ink on his chin and a toad in his hands that appeared to be making a considered escape attempt. "Have you seen a toad?" He looked down at the toad currently attempting to free itself from between his fingers. Right. Never mind. Come in if you want, Harry said. You look like you've been searching a while. The boy dropped into the seat beside Hermione with the exhausted relief of someone who had given up on dignity. He's done this 4 times. Gran gave him to me and I don't even like toads, but she'd be devastated if I lost him before I even got to school. He paused. I'm Neville. Neville Longbottom. Harry Potter. This is Hermione Granger. Neville's eyes went briefly wide at Harry's name and then he clearly decided that mentioning it would be rude and looked at the toad instead. Harry appreciated this more than he would have appreciated most things. What's his name? Hermione asked, peering at the toad with the expression of someone who was filing it under things I now know about toads. Trevor. Neville held the toad up slightly. Trevor looked profoundly unimpressed with his circumstances. The latch on that cage, Harry nodded at the empty owl cage in the rack above, Ptolemy having been freed to ride in the owl car at the front. You could put him in there for the journey. He won't be able to push through those bars. Neville looked at the cage with the expression of someone to whom this had not occurred. Yes. Thank you. He settled Trevor into the cage with a relief so palpable it was almost funny. Trevor peered out through the bars with beady resigned eyes. The 3 of them sat together for the rest of the journey. Harry learned that Neville came from a long wizarding family, that his parents had been Aurors who were now in St. Mungos, he said it quickly and quietly, clearly practiced at getting through it without the full weight landing, and that he was convinced he was barely magical enough for Hogwarts. He'd accidentally made his grandmother's begonia sing at age 6, repotted it in a panic, and nothing particularly dramatic had happened since. Accidental magic at 6 is absolutely within the normal range, Hermione told him, with the confidence of someone who had read the developmental literature. Gran says I'm a late bloomer. What do you want to study? Harry asked. Neville blinked, like the question of what he wanted hadn't been the framework he was applying to Hogwarts. Herbology, he said, after a moment. I'm good with plants. He said it like it was a confession rather than a qualification. That's actually quite rare, Harry said. The theoretical basis for herbology as it relates to potions and warding, the properties of plants as magical mediators, there's a whole Gringotts archive section on Potter estate greenhouse records that goes back 4 centuries, and the magical varieties they were cultivating are things that don't even appear in modern textbooks anymore. Neville was looking at him with an expression of genuine arrested interest for the first time since he'd come in. What kind of varieties? I'll send you the references when I get proper library access. Harry meant it straightforwardly, not as a gift or a performance of generosity. He had information that would interest someone who knew things he didn't, which was how exchanges were supposed to work. The train arrived at Hogsmeade Station in the dark, which was clearly deliberate. You were supposed to see Hogwarts for the first time by torchlight and across the lake, and Harry understood immediately why. Even knowing what he knew about the foundations and the ownership and the ward schema, even having read the architect's records and the founder's documents and the goblin surveys from 4 centuries of estate management, he looked up at the castle on the hill with the lights in the windows and the towers against the sky and he felt it in his chest like something clicking into place. It wasn't just beautiful. It was his, in the complicated, specific way that things you'd inherited were yours, not because you made them but because the people who made them had put them in your hands as an act of faith. He didn't say this. He stood in the boats and looked at it, Hermione beside him asking Hagrid, an enormous man who managed boats with the cheerful ease of someone who found nothing about his own size unusual, questions about the squid, and Neville gripping his seat with both hands and staring at the castle with wide eyes. All right? Harry said to Neville. It's real, Neville said, quietly. Yes. I kept thinking, I knew it was real. But it's real, Harry agreed. Neville looked at him and something in his expression relaxed slightly, the way things did when someone understood without requiring explanation. Yeah. The Great Hall was everything the historical documents suggested and more. Harry walked in and looked up at the ceiling first, the bewitched sky, deep September dark with the beginning of stars, and then around at the 4 long tables and the hundreds of candles and the staff at the high table. He found Dumbledore without difficulty, the silver beard and the robes and the particular quality of being in a room and seeming to occupy a slightly larger portion of it than your physical form required. Dumbledore was already looking at him. Harry looked back, even and steady, and after a moment Dumbledore inclined his head slightly. Harry did the same. A greeting between two people who knew each other from a context nobody else in the room was aware of. Professor McGonagall appeared, stern, upright, with sharp eyes that moved across the first years with the efficient assessment of someone who was categorizing before she'd been introduced. She explained the sorting, her voice carrying without apparent effort, and Harry listened and watched the other students and tried to work out who they were from how they stood. He identified Draco Malfoy immediately. Not because of the white blonde hair, though that was distinctive, but because of the way he held himself, the practiced carelessness of someone who had been told they were significant and had decided to believe it unconditionally. He was scanning the first years with an expression of catalog and classify, and when his eyes landed on Harry they stopped. Harry had read about the Malfoys in the estate records. Lucius Malfoy was a Wisengamot member, significant, old money, allegedly reformed Death Eater, the kind of man who survived political shifts by being more useful than he was dangerous and ensuring everyone knew it. His son had the bearing of someone raised to inherit a specific kind of world. Draco Malfoy crossed the waiting first years with the ease of someone who assumed space would be made for him. Potter, he said, which was not a question. He'd clearly done his homework. I'm Malfoy. Draco Malfoy. I know, Harry said. Something flickered in Malfoy's eyes, a recalibration. He'd expected either recognition of his family name's significance or ignorance of it. Getting neither was apparently interesting to him. I can help you navigate things, he said. Who's worth knowing? Who isn't? He glanced at Neville with the particular expression of someone writing a person off. You don't want to end up with the wrong sort. I'll make my own assessments, Harry said, pleasantly. But thank you. Malfoy's eyes narrowed slightly. My father says Dumbledore's whatever your father says about Dumbledore is probably worth hearing, Harry said. He's not wrong about everything. Neither is Dumbledore. I try not to outsource my opinions to either of them. There was a pause. Draco Malfoy looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was recalculating faster than Harry expected. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, not the practiced aristocratic thing he'd been wearing when he walked over, but something slightly more genuine. You're not what I expected. Nobody ever is. McGonagall began calling names and the conversation ended, but Harry was aware of Malfoy's eyes on him throughout, watchful and reassessing, like someone who had come in with a strategy and was now wondering if it needed revision. When McGonagall called Potter, Harry, the hall went quiet in the specific way of rooms that have been waiting for something. Harry walked up to the stool without hesitation. He sat. The sorting hat came down over his eyes and he was in the dark, and then the hat spoke. Well, it said, in a voice that was old and amused and dry as ancient parchment. I have been waiting for you. Have you? Harry thought. I haven't sorted a Gryffindor heir in a very long time. The bloodline has a particular weight. A pause. You carry rather a lot of weight altogether. Is that a problem? For you? No. For some of the people around you, possibly. The hat seemed to be turning something over. You could go anywhere, you know. The Slytherin cunning is certainly there. The Ravenclaw intellect. The Hufflepuff steadiness. You have all four in good measure. But the Gryffindor in you isn't about bravery, exactly. Not the charging forward kind. You're brave in the way deep water is deep, quietly, and completely, and in ways people tend to underestimate until they're in it. A warm rumble that Harry interpreted as laughter. Besides, the heir of Godric Gryffindor, Slytherin. The symbolism alone would cause problems. Then, Gryffindor. The table on the far left erupted. Harry took the hat off, placed it calmly back on the stool, and walked to his table through the noise. He sat down between a red-haired boy who immediately started talking about his brothers and a girl who was already eating despite the feast not having been served yet and didn't appear to find this unusual. He looked up at the staff table. Dumbledore was applauding with everyone else, wearing an expression of genuine warmth that Harry believed in at least partially. Whatever else Dumbledore was or wasn't, he did care about this school. Harry was sure of that. To Dumbledore's right, a man with lank black hair and a sallow face was not applauding. He was looking at Harry with an expression that started as the flat assessment of the professional and became something more complicated in the 10 seconds Harry looked at him, a flicker of something old and not resolved, an emotion Harry couldn't read from across the hall but filed under ask about later. Severus Snape. Professor of Potions. The records listed him as a former student, exceptional at his subject, and the tone of the 3 separate references in estate documents was one of significant absence. He was mentioned in legal records relating to the Potter family in ways that were specific and never explained, and Harry had been meaning to get Ironclaw to clarify. He would clarify. Soon. Neville was sorted into Gryffindor 10 minutes later with an expression of faint surprised relief, and he sat across from Harry and immediately relaxed by approximately 40%. Hermione was sorted shortly after. The hat was on her head for barely 3 seconds before it called Gryffindor with what sounded like enthusiasm, and she sat beside Neville, opened her bag, took out a notebook, and began writing things down, which was so exactly what Harry would have predicted that he found it deeply reassuring. The feast appeared and was extraordinary, and Harry ate with the specific appreciation of someone who had spent 10 years with the burnt end of the loaf. He talked to the red-haired boy, who was Ron Weasley, youngest brother, clearly positioned in his family as the newest in a long line of them, with the particular slightly defensive cheerfulness of someone who had learned to be good company so that people would overlook the comparisons. Harry liked him. He filed him differently from Hermione and Neville, not the same immediate certainty, but something genuine and warm. He watched the staff. He watched Quirrell, who sat near the end of the table and had a stutter that seemed to come and go, and who kept flinching at loud sounds, and who smelled, and this was odd enough that Harry noted it specifically, of something that was not quite garlic and not quite damp stone. Something older than either. Something that prickled. He watched Snape, who ate without apparently tasting anything and spent most of the feast in conversation with the woman to his right about something that appeared to be tedious and yet held his attention completely. He looked, finally, at the ceiling. The stars were out now, fully. The enchantment was excellent. He'd read the documentation on it in the ward schema, and it was a piece of ongoing spellwork that had been maintained continuously since the Founders' period, updated and reinforced by each successive generation of Hogwarts staff, a living piece of magic that was genuinely impressive. His land. His ceiling. His stars. I'm here, he thought to no particular person. I'm here and I know what this is and I'm not going to waste it. The first week was information-dense and Harry absorbed it methodically. He discovered that Professor McGonagall was excellent, rigorous, exacting, with the particular teaching quality of someone who genuinely loved their subject and found its beauties inexhaustible. She turned a matchstick into a needle in the first Transfiguration lesson with the casual precision of long mastery, and something in Harry responded to watching it the way it responded to reading the grimoires, with the specific hunger of a person who recognizes their medium. He was careful in class. Not hiding, never that. He'd made a decision about hiding and it was a clean one, but methodical. He listened first. He watched how the subject worked before he applied his hands to it. He did not want to set anything on fire accidentally, which had happened twice at home with the warming charm, or produce a result so dramatic it derailed the lesson. He had a lifetime of things to learn here. He could afford to start from the beginning. His matchstick became a needle on the second attempt in Transfiguration. The needle was perfect, uniform, polished, with a correct eye. McGonagall looked at it with an expression that was professionally restrained but contained unmistakable satisfaction. She showed it to the class without a word of context, which was, Harry thought, the best kind of praise. Potions was different. Snape's classroom was in a dungeon and cold even in September, and Snape himself was cold in a way that wasn't atmospheric. He walked between the desks on the first day and spoke about potions in a voice that was measured and almost beautiful in its precision, bewitching of the mind, the ensnaring of the senses, and Harry listened to the cadence of it and heard a man who genuinely loved the subject in the same way McGonagall loved hers, but had arranged the love behind so much else that it came out sideways. "Potter," Snape said, the first time he stopped at Harry's desk. His voice changed slightly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just, differently. "The boy who lived. Our new celebrity." Harry looked up at him. "Professor." Snape's eyes were cold and black and were doing the same calculation they'd been doing across the great hall at the feast. "Tell me, Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry had read magical drafts and potions twice. He had also read a more advanced text from the Potter Library at Salas Beag. The grimoire collection included a volume on advanced potion theory by a 17th-century Potter who had been obsessed with the subject. "The draft of living death," he said. "Though the specific quality depends on the preparation of the asphodel, powdered versus crushed affects the final sedative depth quite significantly. There's a note in Quintus Dalloway's Principles suggesting that lunar phase timing at the wormwood harvest changes the alkaloid concentration, which would also affect the final potency." Snape went still for half a second. Just half a second. "Where the devil is the bezoar found, and what is it?" "The stomach of a goat. It acts as a broad antidote to most common poisons. There are exceptions. Veritaserum can't be counteracted by it, for instance, and it's ineffective against some of the more complex dark artifacts that work through the blood rather than the digestive system." The silence in the classroom was total. Snape stared at him. "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "There isn't one. Different names for the same plant, also called aconite. Though there are 3 related species that are sometimes confused for it and are significantly less effective as ingredients, which is why the potions trade uses the Latin aconitum napellus as the standard identifier." Snape said nothing for a moment. His expression was complicated. Not the cold professional assessment. Something else, working underneath it. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, and moved on to the next desk. Harry watched him go. He thought about the estate records and the references to Snape that Ironclaw had never clarified for him. He thought about the way Snape had looked at him at the feast, the complicated emotion that wasn't hatred, though it contained something. He thought about his mother, who had been extraordinary at magic, who had grown up in a world where this man had also been young. He filed it under understand better and turned to his cauldron. Hermione, beside him, was measuring her daisy roots with the expression of someone who had prepared for this the way other people prepared for surgery. She glanced sideways at Harry. "You read Quintus Dalloway?" "My family library has an extensive potions section." "I didn't know that existed." "Principles." "What's the full title?" "Dalloway's Principles of Advanced Alchemical Preparation, 1672. It's not widely available. I can probably get you a copy through the estate records office." Hermione's measuring stopped. She looked at him fully. "You can access the actual texts. Not just references." "Most of them, yes." She turned back to her cauldron and chopped her herbs with renewed energy. "I'm going to need to know more about this estate records office," she said. "I assumed you would be," Harry said. "I'll explain properly outside of potions." He told them. Not everything, the full scope was a very long story with a lot of numbers, but the shape of it. He told Hermione and Neville on Sunday afternoon in a corner of the common room that was empty because everyone else was outside, the September sunlight being too good to waste indoors. He told them about Gringotts and the test and the houses, and Dumbledore and the leases, and the 2 years of letters and the audit, and the grimoires from Salas Beag. Hermione's face moved through several expressions: shock, rapid reassessment, something that looked almost like outrage, settling finally into the particular focused intensity she wore when information was arranging itself into a framework she could use. "He's been using Potter estate properties for 8 years without payment or consent," she said. I mean, legally, that's what Gringotts said. And there's a formal audit process underway. Yes. And the 63,000 galleons. Also yes. And you have 3 Wisengamot seats that have been functioning as de facto abstentions in real votes. Yes. Hermione sat back. The scale of this is, she stopped. Why are you telling us? The question was honest and he appreciated it. Because you're going to notice things, he said. Both of you. You're both sharp and you pay attention, and some of what I do here is going to look strange to you without context, and I'd rather you had context. He paused. And because I could use the help, honestly. Hermione, you think in systems better than almost anyone I've met. Neville, I don't think I'm going to be much use in a legal argument, Neville said. I know. But the Hogsmeade properties. I've been reading about the grounds and some of the estate agricultural records, and there are things growing in areas adjacent to the Forbidden Forest that appear in the Potter records as intentional plantings from the Founders' period. I want to know what they are and whether they're still viable. He looked at Neville. And I'm going to have to make decisions about this whole school, Neville, the grounds and the wards and the maintenance, and I could use someone who actually knows what they're looking at when we go outside. Neville blinked. You want me to look at plants? I want your expert opinion on estate grounds that may contain 400-year-old magical species. The expression on Neville's face was the one he'd had on the boat, looking up at the castle, the "this is real" expression, but with something added. The sense that real was now also his. Right, he said. Yes. Absolutely. So we're doing this, Hermione said. Not a question. We're helping you manage a wizarding inheritance dispute involving the headmaster of our school and 15 ancient magical houses. I'm managing it. I'd appreciate help thinking through the parts one haven't gotten to yet. I have questions. I assumed you would. Several hundred, approximately. I'd rather address them over multiple sessions than in one go. She almost smiled. Fair. They sat in their corner of the common room and the fire crackled, and outside the window the grounds were green and golden in the September light, and Harry looked at the two of them, Hermione already pulling out her notebook, Neville already thinking about the grounds with the focused expression of someone who had just been given permission to care about something, and thought about what he'd said on the train to Privet Drive. Found family versus blood. He'd read that framing somewhere in one of the older grimoires, talking about why the magical houses sustain themselves through chosen stewards as often as through blood. The logic being that the blood gives you the claim but the choosing determines what you do with it. He was choosing. He thought his mother would have found that reasonable. The first time Dumbledore summoned him, it was a Thursday evening 3 weeks into term, a note delivered by McGonagall with a neutral expression and a slight tension around her eyes that she was clearly controlling. Harry went without hurry. Dumbledore's office was a circular room full of gently moving silver instruments and portrait paintings of former headmasters, most of whom were pretending to be asleep with varying degrees of conviction. The phoenix, Fawkes, was on his perch and regarded Harry with warm, ancient eyes when he came in. Dumbledore was standing behind his desk. He waited until Harry sat down across from him. I understand, Dumbledore said, that you've been telling your housemates about the inheritance situation. I've told 2 people the outline. Harry. A pause, and the quality of it was careful. I want to ask you to be discreet. Not to protect my reputation, I'm long past caring about that in the way young people sometimes imagine. But the legal process is ongoing, and, I trust them, Harry said. And they're going to notice things whether I tell them or not. Hermione notices everything, and Neville is the kind of person who pays more attention than he gets credit for. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I'm not making announcements. I told 2 people I've decided to trust. At 11. You trusted my parents when they were students. You thought they were worth something. I'm making similar assessments. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He sat down. He looked, in the warm light of his office, like someone who was carrying a great deal and had learned to carry it in a way that didn't show except when he stopped moving. "You are very like Lily," he said. "People keep telling me that. Do you mind?" Harry considered it genuinely. "No. From everything I can find, she was remarkable." He paused. "Was she, in your experience?" Something moved through Dumbledore's face, old grief, old warmth, the particular ache of someone who had watched someone brilliant and young go to their death at least partly along a path he'd helped lay. "Yes," he said, very simply. "She was extraordinary." "Then no. I don't mind." They sat with that for a moment. "The return of the funds," Dumbledore said. "My solicitors are, the process is, ongoing," Harry said, with the same tone Ironclaw used. "I know. I want you to know that he stopped. Started again. What was done with genuine intention to protect. I need you to believe that, even if the methods were wrong." "I believe the intention," Harry said. "The methods are what Gringotts is addressing." He stood up, because the important things had been said and he had homework in this office, though extraordinary, was also somewhere he could come back to. "Professor. The Sorcerer's Stone. The one in Vault 713. Dumbledore went entirely still. "I read the transfer records," Harry said. "It moved from Gringotts to Hogwarts in July. It's somewhere in this school." He kept his voice even. "I'm not asking for details. I'm telling you that I know it's here, and that if something is going to happen on my property that involves a target that Voldemort would want, I'd like to be aware of it." The name didn't make him flinch. Dumbledore noticed this. "Harry, I'm not asking to be involved in whatever you're doing about it. I'm asking to be told enough to not accidentally walk into something." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "I'm 11. I understand that. But I'm also lord of this estate and you are currently, I say this without anger, a lessee who is in arrears." The air in the room was very quiet. Fawkes made a soft sound on his perch. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, 11 years old, wearing his school robes with his crooked glasses pushed up his nose, meeting the gaze of the most powerful wizard in Britain with the specific quality of calm that came not from fearlessness but from knowing exactly what ground you were standing on. "The stone is protected," Dumbledore said. "Heavily. By protections designed to prevent anyone who wants to use it from retrieving it." "Are the protections on my ward's schema or separate?" A pause. "They involve your wards, yes, as a foundation layer." "Then they're using my infrastructure." Not angry. Factual. "Good. At least they'll hold." He moved toward the door. "Good night, Professor." "Good night, Harry." He walked out of the circular office and down the moving staircase and into the corridor, and the castle was warm around him, his castle, which had been here for 1,000 years and would be here long after both of them were gone, full of secrets and stone and the accumulated magic of generations, and Harry walked back toward Gryffindor Tower with his hands in his pockets and his mind already on the next thing. He had homework. He had Hermione's first set of 300 questions to begin addressing, Neville's plant research to look up in the estate archives, and a letter to write to Ironclaw about the ward schema. He was 11 years old and lord of 15 houses and enrolled as a first-year student at his own school, and somewhere above him the enchanted ceiling showed the stars in their proper positions and the candles burned in their brackets and the whole ancient structure hummed along as it had hummed for 1,000 years. He thought it was humming slightly differently tonight. More like a house that knew its owner had come home. Chapter 4, Foundations and Fault Lines. October arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, abruptly, completely, as if the castle had simply decided that September was finished and made the change overnight. The grounds went gold and red, the lake went dark and serious, and the corridors developed a chill that no amount of warming charms from the professors fully addressed because the stone itself was cold and old and indifferent to comfort. Harry liked it. He liked the way the castle changed with the season, the way you could feel the shift in the wards, subtle, a slight recalibration of ambient magic, like a large organism adjusting its breathing. He noticed it the way he noticed the rosebush at Privet Drive responding to attention, the way he noticed Trevor the Toad's escape attempts becoming more half-hearted as Neville became more confident. He noticed things in layers now, the surface and the structure underneath. Hermione had asked him, one evening in the library, how he knew the wards had shifted. "I don't know how to explain it," he'd said honestly. "It's like hearing a piece of music you know well and noticing one instrument is playing slightly differently." "That's a synesthetic description," she'd said, writing something down. "The magical signature of the estate resonating with your claim. There's a section in Griphook's foundational theory of blood inheritance, which is not on any reading list and I had to argue with Madame Pants for 20 minutes to access, that describes something similar. The lord of an estate doesn't just own it legally. The magic runs both ways. Like a conversation," Harry had said. Exactly like a conversation. She'd looked pleased in the way she always did when a metaphor landed properly. He'd been thinking about that since. The castle talking to him in the language of small adjustments. The wards noting his presence, the grounds responding to his attention. He hadn't done anything deliberate with it, not yet, but it was there, a current running underneath everything, and he paid attention to it the way you paid attention to anything that was trying to communicate. The other thing October brought was Quidditch. Harry had read about Quidditch the way he'd read about everything else, methodically, before experiencing it, which Hermione approved of and Ron Weasley found completely baffling. Ron had been sitting in the common room when Harry came in from the library with Quidditch Through the Ages under his arm and looked at him with the expression of someone watching a person read the manual for a bicycle rather than just getting on it. "You could just watch a practice," Ron said. "I will. I wanted the context first. It's Quidditch. It's also 7 different moving targets, 30 feet of altitude, and the primary cause of magical sports injuries in Britain." Context seemed reasonable. Ron opened his mouth and closed it again. He was learning, over the weeks, that arguing with Harry's logic was like arguing with a very pleasant wall. The wall didn't take it personally, it didn't budge, and you always came away feeling that the fault was somehow yours. He'd started doing the context reading himself, which Harry thought was probably the best possible outcome. The first flying lesson was on a grey Thursday morning, the ground damp, the brooms lined up in the courtyard looking ancient and slightly resentful. Madame Hooch, who had the sharp yellow eyes and direct manner of someone who had very little patience for people who fell off brooms and then complained about it, walked the class through the basics with efficient precision. Harry listened. He stood by his broom, left hand extended, thought up, and the broom came to his hand on the first try with a confidence that suggested the magic had been waiting for permission. He felt the quality of it immediately, the flight potential, the way the air moved differently now that the broom was in his hand. Something in his blood recognized it. The estate records had extensive documentation on Potter family participation in Quidditch across centuries, and he'd read about his father being a chaser and read it the same way he read everything, as information. But standing here with the broom in his hand was the first time the information resolved into something physical. He understood his father better in that moment than he had in all the records. When Madame Hooch turned her back to deal with Neville, who had drifted upward accidentally and looked deeply uncertain about the process of coming back down, Draco Malfoy leaned across his broom and said to Harry, loud enough for the surrounding students to hear, "First years shouldn't have to wait for lessons to get on a broom. Some of us have been flying since we were 6. "Good," Harry said. "Then you should be excellent." Malfoy blinked. This was not the response he'd engineered for. "I am, actually." "I know. Your family has produced 3 Slytherin Quidditch captains in the last 50 years. The Malfoy Vault records." Harry stopped, because this was information he had from estate cross-references and he'd been about to cite it without thinking. He recalibrated. "Your family has a flying reputation." Malfoy was looking at him with that expression again, the one from the sorting queue, calculating and reassessing. "How do you know about Malfoy Vault records?" "I don't." "The Quidditch history. It's in the books." It wasn't entirely a lie. The Quidditch history was in the books. The vault reference had slipped out from a different source. Malfoy seemed to accept it, but his eyes stayed sharp, and Harry noted that Draco Malfoy's sharpness was consistently underestimated by people who focused on his arrogance and missed what was underneath it. That was going to be a problem, eventually, or possibly a resource. He hadn't decided which. When Madame Hooch had Neville safely down and left to take him to the hospital wing, probably, from the angle of the landing, Malfoy grabbed Neville's remembrall and went up. Harry went up after him without thinking about it, which was the only thing that happened in the whole year that he'd genuinely describe as impulsive. He just went, the broom responding to him with a smoothness that felt like the continuation of something that should always have been happening, and the air hit him cold and clean at 30 feet, and he thought this in the part of his mind that wasn't already tracking Malfoy's position and the angle of the remembrall throw. Malfoy threw it. Harry went after it, angled down and accelerating, and the ground came up fast and he pulled out of the dive 20 feet up with the remembrall in his closed fist, the magic in him running hot and satisfied in a way that was similar to but distinct from the magic he used in lessons. He landed clean. McGonagall was on the steps. He had a brief moment of working out the geometry of trouble. He'd flown without permission, he'd essentially challenged another student, Madame Hooch had explicitly said nobody was to fly while she was gone, all of this was factually true. And then McGonagall said, "Potter, follow me," in a tone that gave him no particular information about how this was going to go. He followed her through the castle at a pace that suggested urgency, up 2 flights, to a corridor he hadn't been to yet. She knocked on a door, opened it without waiting, and said into the room, "Oliver, I've found you a seeker." Oliver Wood looked up from a piece of parchment covered in Quidditch diagrams and stared at Harry with the expression of a man who has received a gift he wasn't expecting and isn't sure the universe intends it seriously. McGonagall turned to Harry. "Your father was an excellent Quidditch player," she said. The professional crispness in her voice was still there, but something underneath it wasn't quite as crisp. "The rule about first-year students not having their own brooms was implemented before your father's time. I see no reason it cannot be reviewed." She looked at the remembrall in his hand. "You will also return that to Mr. Longbottom." "Of course," Harry said. She left. Oliver Wood immediately launched into a 15-minute explanation of Quidditch strategy with the speed and density of a man who had been waiting his entire Hogwarts career for a seeker who could catch a remembrall in a vertical dive, and he was not going to waste a single second. Harry listened to all of it, asked 3 questions, and walked out of the room a member of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. He went to find Neville first, before the common room, before dinner, before anything else. Neville was in the hospital wing with a bandaged wrist and the guilty expression of someone who had been causing trouble without intending to. Harry handed him the remembrall and sat on the end of his bed. "You all right?" "It's just a sprain." Neville turned the remembrall over. "You didn't have to, you know he would have you just got out of your first flying lesson in one piece," Harry said. "He took your thing." "That was wrong, and it was correctable, so I corrected it." Neville looked at him. "He might make things difficult." "Malfoy. His father is a complicated man in a complicated position," Harry said. "Draco is working out who he wants to be separate from that. I don't think he's decided yet." He paused. "You should also know I'm on the Quidditch team now, apparently." Neville blinked. That was fast. Things tend to move quickly when McGonagall decides something is a good idea. Neville almost laughed, which was better than the guilty expression. "I've been thinking about the grounds," he said. "The areas near the forest. There's a section on the east side that has plants I don't recognize from any of the textbooks. Some of them look like they're maintaining themselves, like they have ongoing enchantments on them, and Professor Sprout says she's never had authorization to catalog them because they're technically outside the school grounds boundary." Harry went still. "Outside the school grounds boundary but still on the estate." "That's what I thought." The estate records marked the full perimeter as encompassing everything within the outer ward boundary, which runs about a third of a mile past the school grounds official boundary. Harry thought about the founder's records, the deliberate plantings Ironclaw had referenced. Those plants were put there on purpose. Probably by someone in my family line, if the timing fits the estate records. He paused. Can you show me this weekend? Neville's expression did the thing again, the thing where being asked for expertise made him reassemble slightly. Yes. Absolutely. Saturday morning was cold and clear, the frost still on the grass at 9 o'clock, their breath coming out in small clouds as they walked toward the tree line. Neville had his herbology notebook. Harry had the portable copies of the relevant estate records that Ironclaw had sent him, sections of the Founders' period horticultural documentation, which she'd flagged as potentially interesting and which he'd been meaning to cross-reference with the actual grounds. The section Neville had found was on the east side, where the forest curved and the official grounds ended at a low stone marker that Harry crouched beside and examined. The marker had estate markings on it, old ones, weathered almost smooth, but unmistakably the Potter crest in its pre-consolidation form, which meant these markers predated even the Potter-Peverell inheritance. This is original, Harry said. From when? The Founders' period, at a guess. He straightened and looked at the planting area beyond the marker. Neville was already ahead of him, crouching over a low-growing plant with silver-edged leaves that caught the morning light at an angle that was slightly too consistent to be natural. Hedera atramentalis, Neville said, in the tone of someone confirming something they'd suspected. He looked up. That's in the Gringotts archives section you showed me. There's a reference to a silver ivy cultivar specifically bred for ward reinforcement. The leaves produce a resin that integrates with stone-based protective enchantments. Harry crouched beside Neville. The plant was healthy, thriving, actually, the silver edges sharp and the growth dense along the ground. It's been maintaining itself for potentially 500 years. Not quite. Neville pointed to a section where the growth was newer, the leaves slightly smaller. Someone pruned this. Not recently, 10, 15 years ago, maybe, but deliberately. The growth pattern after that cut is different. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Harry looked at the pruning pattern. He thought about who had been managing the estate grounds for the past 15 years before the Gringotts audit began. He thought about the name on the lease documents. Dumbledore, he said. Neville looked at him. He's been managing these grounds as part of the lease arrangement. The fact that someone maintained these plantings, it means he knew what they were. He knew the estate extended past the school grounds' official boundary and he knew what was growing here. Harry wasn't angry. He was thinking. He's been maintaining them, which means he understands their function in the ward system. Is that bad? No. Harry stood up. That's actually good. It means the wards are intact and someone competent has been looking after them. He paused. But it also means there's a category of estate knowledge that Dumbledore has been operating from that I don't have full access to yet. He made a note. He and Neville spent 2 hours cataloging the planting section, with Neville doing the identification work. His accuracy was extraordinary, Harry noticed, the way he could read a plant's condition and history from its growth pattern the way Harry read tone from a letter, and Harry cross-referencing against the estate records. They found 7 distinct species, all of them pre-1500, all of them with specific functions in the ward's schema that were nowhere in the standard Hogwarts documentation. One of them, a root plant that had spread extensively under the frost line, was the foundational anchor for the perimeter ward. Without it, Ironclaw's document suggested, the perimeter ward would degrade to roughly 40% of its current strength within a decade. Harry sat on the cold ground and looked at this information. Neville, he said. This root. How would you describe its current health? Neville had both hands in the soil, eyes slightly unfocused in the way he went when he was really paying attention. Stable. Slightly stressed, maybe, the frost is early this year and it doesn't love early frost, it's a temperate species. But not failing. He paused. It could use, there's a nutrient compound in Dalloways that I've been wanting to try on stressed specimens. Something in the nitrogen balance that the standard approaches miss. We're going to need Sprout's help for this, Harry said. I'll talk to her. You're going to tell a professor that you found a previously undocumented species maintaining a ward anchor on estate grounds that aren't officially part of the school. I'm going to tell her I've been reviewing the estate records and found documentation on some historical plantings beyond the school boundary that appear to require maintenance, and ask if she'd be willing to assess them professionally. He looked at Neville. She knows herbology. I want her to know what she's looking at. She's going to ask questions. Good. I like it when people ask good questions. He spoke to Professor Sprout on Monday. She was in Greenhouse 2 when he found her, doing something precise with a tray of seedlings that she didn't look up from immediately when he came in. She had the quality of someone who had spent so long with plants that the human world had to make a reasonable case for her attention before she fully directed it. Mr. Potter. She looked up and assessed him with the frank gaze of someone who didn't waste time on social staging. I had a feeling you'd come to see me. About the east grounds. Longbottom told me you'd been out there. Not accusatory, just noting. Extraordinary boy, Longbottom. Better eye than any student I've had in 10 years. She set down her trowel. What do you want to know? What do you already know? Harry asked. A pause. She looked at him with a new quality of attention. That the east section is estate grounds outside the official school boundary. That it has plantings I've never been given authorization to touch. That those plantings are old, very old, and in better condition than they should be if nobody's been managing them. She folded her hands. And that they're not decorative. No, Harry said. They're functional. Ward integrated, mostly. He pulled out the relevant sections of the estate documentation. I've been going through the founder's period records. These plantings are specifically keyed to the outer perimeter wards. The Hedera atramentalis on the east boundary integrates with the stone enchantments, the root network under the frost line is a foundational anchor for the perimeter ward, and there are two others I haven't fully identified yet. Sprout took the documents. She read them with the focused speed of someone who processed plant information quickly and everything else at the same rate as a normal person. This root compound, she said, looking up. The nitrogen balance issue. Longbottom mentioned it. He thinks the Dalloway approach might work. He's probably right. She looked at the documents again, then at Harry. You're the lord of this estate. Yes. Which means you have authority over these grounds. Yes. And you're coming to me rather than, I don't know, sending an estate management letter through Gringotts, or raising it with the headmaster. Because you know plants better than anyone else here and the plants need attention, Harry said. The estate management letters go through Ironclaw. The headmaster is already aware of the general situation. But this is a practical, immediate thing that requires someone who actually knows what they're doing on the ground. He met her eyes. I'd like your professional assessment and, if you're willing, your ongoing involvement with the estate grounds. Formally. With appropriate compensation from the estate. Sprout looked at him for a long moment. She had, Harry thought, the expression of someone who had been doing their job quietly and competently for a long time and wasn't used to having the work named properly. I'll need to speak to the headmaster, she said. Of course. He'll tell you it's complicated. It is. Harry paused. But the plants don't care about the complications. They just need looking after. She almost smiled. Come back Thursday with that Dalloway reference and I'll have had a look at the anchor route by then. She picked up her trowel again. And bring Longbottom. Whatever you're paying him in attention is working, but he could stand to hear directly from me that he's got a proper gift. The letter from Ironclaw arrived on a Wednesday, which was unusual. The letters always came Thursday, without exception. Harry read it in the breakfast hall before the owls had fully dispersed, standing beside the Gryffindor table with his parchment and Ptolemy on his shoulder regarding the other owls with mild superiority. The letter was brief and the brevity was significant. We have completed the preliminary trace on the discretionary account disbursements. Of the 63,000 galleons, 41,000 have been identified as flowing to a set of accounts maintained in the name of an entity called the Greater Good Educational Foundation, registered 1982, dissolved 1994. The foundation's primary activity appears to have been grant funding for academic research. The recipient of the largest single grant, 12,000 galleons in 1985, was a researcher working on ancient magic defensive theory under the sponsorship of Albus Dumbledore. We believe you should have this information before Thursday's formal update. Iron Claw. Harry read it twice. He folded it carefully. He put it in his inner robe pocket. He sat down and ate his breakfast and thought about it. He thought, Dumbledore genuinely believed he was fighting something. The grant, the research, ancient magic defensive theory. He was trying to understand what had happened the night Harry's parents died, what had protected Harry, what the mechanism was. He had used money that wasn't his to fund research into a question that was, genuinely, about Harry's safety. The intention was real. Harry had believed it when Dumbledore said it in the sitting room at Privet Drive, and he believed it now. The intention was real and the methods were wrong, and the fact that you believed in your cause didn't transfer ownership of other people's resources to you. He thought, Dumbledore knew all of this. Dumbledore was not a stupid man or a dishonest one in the deep grain of him. He had constructed a framework over years in which the necessity was sufficient justification, and the framework had held because nobody had questioned it, and now someone was questioning it, and the framework was being examined and found to be a framework rather than a foundation. He thought, what do I want from this? Not punishment. He was discovering, a person who found satisfaction in punishment. Not exposure. The last thing he needed was the wizarding world making this into a story before he had the tools to control what the story meant. Not an apology, exactly, though an accounting would be appropriate. What he wanted was the money back in his vaults and the properties properly transferred and the Wisengamot seats functioning, and, most of all, really, underneath the practical things, he wanted Dumbledore to admit, fully and without the architecture of justification, that what he'd done was wrong. Not necessary. Not complicated. Wrong. He thought Dumbledore probably wasn't there yet. He thought he could be patient. The troll happened on Halloween, and Harry had Hermione's account of it afterward, from the bathroom floor with her robes dirty and her voice shaking slightly but her eyes clear and processing. They hadn't been in the bathroom. They'd been in the library, Harry and Ron, because Ron had a charms essay due and had finally accepted that he needed help, and Hermione had gone back to the dormitory early, and they'd heard the announcement and followed the confused flow of students for 30 seconds before Harry said, Hermione, and Ron said, bathroom, and they both ran. The troll was large and wrong in the way that things were wrong when they operated outside their proper context. It moved wrong for the space, its club swinging with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of something that was not measuring consequences. Ron hit it with a spell that made its nose bleed, which distracted it. Harry, who had approximately the half-second available to him and a wand that responded with the same excess of intent he'd been managing for 2 years, caught the troll's club with a Wingardium Leviosa that sent it upward with significantly more force than first-year charm theory accounted for. The club went up and came down. The troll sat down. Professors McGonagall and Snape and Quirrell arrived 30 seconds later, and the story got told and the points were distributed, and through all of it Harry watched Quirrell, who stood near the bathroom door and said very little and whose turban moved slightly in a way that had no obvious cause. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower beside Hermione, who was still writing things down internally, he could tell, processing and filing and reconstructing. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine." A pause. It was very large. "Yes. How did you know to come?" "I knew where you were because you weren't in the common room when the announcement came. You'd said you were going back to the dormitory, but the common room was between the library and the dormitory and you weren't in it." He paused. "And you'd been in the library until late enough that you might not have heard the announcement before you left." She looked at him sideways. "You tracked my likely location. I noticed where you were and where you weren't and drew the obvious conclusion." Another pause. "Thank you," she said. Not in the way people said thank you as punctuation. In the actual way. Obviously, Harry said, using her word from the train, and she made a sound that was almost a laugh. Ron, on Harry's other side, said, that was brilliant, by the way, the club thing. How hard did you hit it? I didn't mean to hit it that hard. But you did. Yes. Ron processed this. Does that happen a lot with you? More than I'd like. Wicked, said Ron, with the tone of someone for whom this was unambiguously positive, and Harry thought, yes, Ron was definitely in the category of people he was going to keep. In November, Harry went to Gringotts. Not for any scheduled appointment, Ironclaw's formal Thursday updates continued by letter. He went because there was a category of business that required in-person verification, and because he'd been thinking since the Wednesday letter about the shape of the financial recovery and had questions that needed direct answers rather than written ones. He went on a Saturday, with a pass from McGonagall that was technically for Hogsmeade but technically covered Diagon Alley if he made the case, which he did, citing estate business and producing a letter from Ironclaw on Gringotts' letterhead that McGonagall read with an expression of someone who was updating several things simultaneously. She signed the pass. He took the Hogsmeade road at a brisk pace, turned off toward Claudius Vane's cottage, because he said he would, knocked, had tea and ginger biscuits with a retired potions merchant who was sharp and funny and told 3 excellent stories about Diagon Alley in the 70s, then fled to Diagon Alley from Vane's sitting room fireplace. Gringotts in November was the same Gringotts it had been in July 2 years ago, the clicking, the clinking, the distant rumble, and also entirely different, because when Harry walked through the brass doors a goblin he didn't recognize looked up from the counter and said, "Lord Potter," and a message went immediately down the line. He was taken through to a formal meeting room he hadn't seen before, larger than the small room where Ragnarok had done the test. Ironclaw was already there, and Ragnarok, and a third goblin Harry didn't know who was introduced as Sharpfang of the legal department and who had the specific quality of stillness that suggested a person accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. "You've reviewed the Wednesday letter," Ironclaw said. "Several times." "The Greater Good Educational Foundation," Ragnarok said. "It's not an unusual vehicle. Charitable foundations are a common mechanism for moving resources without obvious fingerprints. But the grant receipts exist," Harry said. "Gringotts has them, yes. The foundation used a Gringotts account, which is how we were able to trace it. And the research it funded." Sharpfang opened a folder. 7 separate research projects between 1982 and 1993. 5 of them related to ancient protective magic, specifically, the magic of sacrifice and blood protection. 2 related to the nature of Horcruxes. The word landed in the room. Harry hadn't come across it in the estate records. He said so. "No," Ragnarok said. "You wouldn't have. It's a dark magic term. A Horcrux is an object in which a piece of a person's soul is stored. It's the mechanism by which Voldemort survived his apparent death in 1981. He said Voldemort without flinching, which Harry noted and respected. Dumbledore has known about them for some time. His research was attempting to understand how many existed and where they might be. Harry sat very still for a moment. "He used my money to fund research into Voldemort's survival mechanism," he said. "Yes. And didn't tell me. You were 9, then 11. He believed, I know what he believed." Harry looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the conversation in Dumbledore's office, the Sorcerer's Stone, the protections, the heir of this estate. He thought about Dumbledore's face when Harry had said the name without flinching, the slight recalibration. The research. The findings. Do we have access to them? Sharpfang and Ironclaw exchanged a glance. The Foundation retained copies of all funded research. As the Foundation was funded by your estate accounts, and the Foundation's records are held by Gringotts, they're mine, Harry said. Technically, they are estate assets. I'd like them. There is a formal process. Start it, Harry said. Please. He looked at Ragnarok. The Horcruxes. The research. Whatever Dumbledore found out, I need to know it, because whatever Voldemort is going to do, he's going to do it in a way that targets me. He always comes back to me. He paused. Doesn't he? It wasn't really a question. Ragnarok met his eyes. The prophecy suggests as much, yes. Then I need the information. Not because I'm going to do something reckless. Because I can't make good decisions without it. He looked around the table, Ironclaw's sharp focus, Sharpfang's stillness, Ragnarok's watchful ancient eyes. What is it actually going to take to end this? Not manage it. End it. The room was quiet. We don't know yet, Ragnarok said, which was the honest answer. But the research may tell us more. Then let's start there. Harry sat back. The Sorcerer's Stone. It's in Hogwarts. Someone is going to try for it. Quirrell, said Sharpfang, with the tone of confirming something already established. You know about Quirrell. Gringotts had a visit from him in July. He attempted to rob Vault 713 the day Dumbledore moved the stone. Ragnarok's expression said quite clearly what he thought about this timing. He failed. The vault was empty. A pause. But he is still in the school. On my property, Harry said. With Voldemort apparently attached to him, yes. Harry processed this. What do you mean attached? Sharpfang opened another folder. The research Dumbledore funded includes a paper on parasitic soul attachment, a Horcrux fragment that has failed to detach from its initial host anchor and requires a living body as an interim vehicle. The symptoms are consistent with Quirrell's observed behavior. Garlic sensitivity, the erratic behavior, the attachment to the back of the head, he paused. The turban. The turban, Harry said. Has it moved? Ironclaw asked. Harry thought about the bathroom and the Halloween feast and every class he'd sat through with Quirrell at the front of the room. Yes. Several times. Then he's close to attempting the stone. Harry looked at the ceiling of the meeting room, which was plain stone and nothing like the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, and he thought about the castle and the wards and the protections Dumbledore had placed and the foundation stones and the Hedera Atramentalis running silver-edged along the frost line. The protection Dumbledore placed, he said. It requires someone who wants to use the stone rather than find it not to be able to retrieve it. That's the mechanism. Yes, said Ironclaw. So if someone just wants to find it, not use it, they can get through. A pause. In theory. Harry stood up. I think I need to go back to school, he said. He looked at Ragnarok. The research documents. As fast as the formal process allows. 3 weeks, Ragnarok said. Thank you. He turned to go and then stopped. The proxy question. For the Wizengamot seats. I've been thinking about it. He pulled a folded parchment from his pocket and put it on the table. These are the names I've identified who meet the Appendix D qualification criteria and who I believe would represent the estate's interests faithfully. I'd like Gringotts to make preliminary approaches, not offers, just approaches, to see if any of them are willing to discuss it. Sharpfang looked at the parchment. His expression shifted in the way goblin expressions shifted, which was minimally and therefore significantly. This is a sophisticated list. I've been building it for a year, Harry said. The third name. I know. She's the most complicated one. Harry picked up his coat. But I think she might say yes. He walked out of the meeting room and through the marble hall and down the stairs into Diagon Alley, where it was cold and bright and busy with Saturday shoppers, and he walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his mind already 3 steps ahead, because that was the only way to do this. Stay 3 steps ahead and keep moving, keep learning, keep building the thing that needed building. He thought about what Sprout had said. The plants don't care about the complications. They just need looking after. He thought she was right about more than plants. He went back to school. He had homework, and Quidditch practice, and a letter to write to Ironclaw, and a conversation to have with Hermione about Horcruxes, which was going to be a very long conversation. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 5. The Landlord's Gambit. The research documents arrived on a Thursday, as everything from Gringotts did, in a package large enough that Ptolemy landed on the breakfast table with the air of a bird who had carried something significant and expected acknowledgement. Harry signed the receipt form, tucked the package under his arm, and finished his porridge with Ron talking on his left about the upcoming Quidditch match against Slytherin and Hermione on his right already watching the package with the specific attention she gave things she intended to read. "Tonight," Harry said to her, without looking up. "Obviously," she said. Ron looked between them. "What's in it?" "Research documents." "Estate stuff?" "Yes." Ron had developed, over the months, a comfortable relationship with the estate situation. He'd been told the outline the same week as Hermione and Neville, and his response had been a long silence followed by, "So Dumbledore's been nicking your money?" Which was reductive but not inaccurate, and after that he'd filed it under Harry's complicated situation and continued being Ron, which was exactly the right response. "Is it important?" "Probably the most important thing I've read yet." Ron considered this. "Do you need me for that or can I go to practice?" "Go to practice." "Right." He stood up, grabbed 2 more pieces of toast, and left, which was also exactly the right response. Harry and Hermione read the documents that evening in the room of requirement, which Hermione had found in the second week of November by the method of needing a place to study that was quiet and walking past the 7th-floor corridor 3 times thinking very firmly about what she needed. She'd told Harry about it and Harry had added it to his mental map of the estate. It was in the ward schema, listed as a responsive space of fluctuating use, which was the founder's way of saying a room that gave you what you required, and it was on his property, and it was extraordinary. Tonight it had given them a long table, 2 comfortable chairs, good lamplight, and silence. Harry spread the documents out. Hermione organized them by date, because that was what she did, and they read. The research was dense and occasionally difficult. Dumbledore's hired academics wrote the way people wrote when they were being thorough for an intelligent audience and didn't expect to be read by an 11-year-old on a Thursday night in a magical responsive room. But the intelligence of it was clear and the methodology was sound, and Hermione read the footnotes aloud when they were significant and Harry read the primary findings and they built the picture together over 2 hours. A Horcrux was a piece of a soul stored in an object. The process of making one required a murder, the act that split the soul, forced the fracture, allowed a piece to be separated and anchored elsewhere. The object then became essentially immortal in the sense that the soul fragment animated it and prevented its natural decay. Voldemort had made Horcruxes. Multiple ones. The research had identified 6 probable Horcruxes, though the academic hedged the number with significant caveats about certainty and methodology. 6 objects. Each containing a fragment of Voldemort's soul. Each one that existed kept him tethered to life regardless of what happened to his physical form. 6, Hermione said. She'd stopped writing halfway through the relevant document and just read. He made 6. The research thinks 6, Harry said. It might be more. The theoretical upper bound, there's a section on it, suggests that beyond 7 total pieces, the soul becomes too fragmented to function with coherent intent. The researcher puts the maximum at 6 Horcruxes plus the original piece that remains in the body. 7 total pieces, Hermione said. For the number 7. Yes. She looked at him over the document. That's why Dumbledore didn't destroy him in 1981. Couldn't. Even if the killing curse had somehow worked on Dumbledore rather than rebounding, Voldemort would have survived. He was already distributed. Yes. And you've known since November that this is the situation. Since Gringotts confirmed it, yes. And Dumbledore has known for longer. The earliest funded research dates to 1984. He's known for at least 7 years. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. Outside the room's conjured walls, the castle was doing its nightly settling, the sounds Harry had learned to separate, the structural shifts of old stone cooling, the specific creak of the third-floor corridor that meant nobody was actually on it, the distant hum of active wards running their ambient cycle. The prophecy, Hermione said. Neither can live while the other survives. That's not just a conflict prediction. Those are the actual mechanics. He can't die while the Horcruxes exist, and you can't, I know, Harry said. She looked at him. There's something else in the prophecy. Something that connects to you specifically, isn't there? Not just that he targeted you. He'd been expecting this. Hermione's brain moved in lines that went past the stated information to the implied architecture, and she'd had long enough with the documents to see the shape of what was there and what wasn't. The research includes a section on the night my parents died, he said. The killing curse rebounded. The researcher's theory is that it rebounded because of blood protection. My mother's sacrifice created a magical shield anchored in me. Love magic, she said. Ancient magic. It's in a history of magic, the theoretical basis, yes. But there's more to it than the shield. He paused, because this next part was the one he'd been sitting with for 2 weeks and still hadn't entirely resolved into something comfortable. The rebound didn't just deflect the curse. It transferred something. The researcher's theory, and this is hedged, this is a theoretical conclusion from circumstantial evidence, is that when the killing curse hit the shield and rebounded, a fragment of Voldemort's soul was severed from the impact and attached. Hermione went very still. Attached to the nearest living vessel, Harry said. Which was me. The silence was different now. The scar, she said. Yes. She looked at his forehead. He let her look without moving. You might be, the research is saying you might be a 7th Horcrux. An unintentional one. The researcher is careful to note that Voldemort didn't plan it. It was a consequence of the rebounding curse, not a deliberate act. He kept his voice even because keeping his voice even was what the situation required and because the alternative was a kind of feeling he'd been carefully not having since he'd read the relevant section 2 weeks ago and needed to keep not having until he had more information. The implication is that destroying the soul fragment in me would require the same method as destroying any other Horcrux. Which is basilisk venom. Fiend fire. The curse itself, in some formulations. He paused. Or, in theory, something else. The researcher's final section is on countermethods. Ancient sacrificial magic, blood protection of the same order as my mother's. The theory is that love magic of sufficient power might be able to excise the fragment without destroying the vessel. Hermione had stopped breathing slightly normally. He noticed this. Hermione. I'm processing, she said. Take the time. She took approximately 45 seconds, which for Hermione was a very long time. Then she said, in a voice that was controlled and precise and had something running underneath it that was not controlled at all, you read this 2 weeks ago. Yes. And you've been going to charms and potions and Quidditch practice and eating breakfast with us every morning for 2 weeks with this in your head. There was nothing immediately actionable, Harry said. The situation isn't changed by me being upset about it. Harry. She looked at him directly, the way she did when she wanted him to understand that she wasn't asking an intellectual question. How are you? I don't know yet, he said honestly. Which was better than fine, which wasn't true, and better than the full answer, which he hadn't fully assembled yet. I know what I want to do about it. Which is? Find the other Horcruxes. Destroy them. Then deal with the question of the one in me, if the researcher's theory is correct, using whatever method doesn't require, the obvious method. He paused. The ancient sacrificial magic approach. There's not enough in the document to know if it's viable. I need more research. I'll start immediately. I know you will. He looked at her. Thank you for don't thank me for treating you like a person with a problem rather than a problem with a person attached, she said, which was one of the most precisely right things anyone had ever said to him, and he sat with it for a moment. Right, he said. Yes. They packed up the documents. Harry locked them in the secure case Ironclaw had included with the package, spelled to open only to his blood, which he'd found grimly appropriate. Hermione was already thinking at full speed. He could see it in the quality of her movement, the slight distraction of someone whose brain was generating faster than their body was tracking. "The sixth Horcrux," she said, at the door. The researcher only identified 5 specific ones. "There's a probable sixth but no identification." "I know. It could be anywhere." "I know. We need Dumbledore's actual files. Not the funded research. His personal notes." "I know that too." Harry looked at her. "I'm working on it." The Wisengamot letter arrived on December 2nd. Harry was in the common room. He read the first paragraph and went to find Hermione. She was in the library, which was where she always was before dinner. She looked up when he sat down across from her, registered his expression, and closed her book. "The proxy approaches," he said. "Gringotts made the preliminary contacts in November. 3 of the 5 names responded. Who said yes? 2 confirmed interest. 1 asked for more information. 2 declined." He looked at the letter. The 3rd name said yes. Hermione's eyes moved to his face, rapid and reading. "The complicated one. Amelia Bones. Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She's a qualified legal practitioner, she's on the Wisengamot independently through her own hereditary seat, and she has a," he paused, "she has a reputation for being interested in exactly the kind of financial misconduct that the estate audit has documented." "She's also Dumbledore's colleague," Hermione said. "She's nobody's colleague," Harry said. "She's her own person. I read everything I could find about her before I put her name on that list. She believes in the law the way you believe in correct information, not as a tool for the powerful but as the actual framework that's supposed to hold. The estate situation is a legal matter. She's a legal person." He paused. "She wrote back through Gringotts and said she wanted a full briefing before committing, and that she had questions. Good questions are good. Very good questions, apparently. Sharpfong sent a note that said they were the most rigorous set of questions any prospective proxy had submitted in 40 years of his practice." Hermione almost smiled. "When do you meet her?" "Christmas break. Gringotts has arranged a formal meeting in their legal chambers." He looked at the letter. "I'm also supposed to attend a preliminary Wisengamot session in January." "Preliminary for what?" "For presenting the audit findings." She went still. "You're presenting to the Wisengamot?" "The Gringotts legal team is presenting. I'm attending as the estate claimant." He met her eyes. "Dumbledore will be there. He's chief warlock. He presides." The quiet between them was the kind that happened when a thing that had been building toward a point finally arrived at it. "Harry," she said. "What are you hoping for? From the Wisengamot session? What does the best outcome look like?" He'd asked himself this question for weeks. He'd tried on different answers and tested them against what he knew of himself and discarded the ones that didn't hold. "I want the estate restored," he said. "The properties, the accounts, the proper legal framework going forward. I want the Wisengamot to formally register my inheritance claims and end the emergency provision framework. I want Dumbledore to have to stand in front of his colleagues and hear the audit read aloud." He paused. "And I want him to say, publicly, on the record, that what he did was wrong. Not justified. Not complicated. Wrong. Do you think he will?" "No," Harry said. "I think he'll justify it. I think he genuinely cannot see it the way it is without the architecture of necessity around it." He looked at the letter. "But the record will exist. And records matter." Christmas at Hogwarts was quiet in the way small numbers of people in large spaces were always quiet, not peaceful exactly, but spacious. Most students went home. Harry didn't, which surprised nobody who knew him and confused the ones who didn't. He had work to do and the castle was good for working. He was in the library on Christmas Eve, the only person in the building, reading through the secondary research material Ironclaw had sent alongside the main documents, when the door opened and Snape walked in. Snape stopped when he saw Harry. A brief recalibration, similar to the one in Potions class in September but quieter. He went to the restricted section, he had his own key, on a chain, and spent several minutes pulling volumes, and Harry went back to his reading, and the silence between them was of the occupied professional variety rather than the hostile kind. It was Snape who spoke first. "You're aware," he said, from the restricted section, not looking at Harry directly, that most students spend Christmas at home. "Most students have homes to go to in the conventional sense," Harry said. A pause. "The Dursley family." "Yes. Lily's sister." Another pause, longer. "I knew your mother," Snape said. It came out the way things came out when they'd been held back for a long time and something had finally shifted the mechanism, not quite intended, not quite accidental. "We grew up in the same town." "I know," Harry said. Snape looked at him then, properly. The black eyes doing their calculation. "You know. The estate records include social history documentation for immediate family associates. You appear in the background of several historical documents." He kept his voice neutral, not cold, not warm, simply honest. "You were her friend. Before Hogwarts." Something moved through Snape's face that was the adult version of the complicated thing Harry had seen at the feast. "Yes," he said. Not defensively. Quietly. "I've been wondering," Harry said, "what she was like. As a person. Not in the records, those are events and legal facts. As a person who knew her." The restricted section was very quiet. Snape stood very still. "Stubborn," he said, eventually. "She argued with everything until she understood it. She didn't accept because she was told to, she had to work through the logic herself and arrive at her own conclusions." A pause. "She was the first person I ever met who treated magic like it was something that could be genuinely understood rather than just practiced." Harry looked at his research document without seeing it for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "Yes." The word was small and final and contained a great deal more than it said. They didn't speak again, but the silence was different afterward, less like two people occupying the same space independently and more like two people who had, quietly, acknowledged something true and were coexisting with it. When Snape left, Harry sat for a while with his documents and thought about his mother arguing with things until she understood them, and thought, yes. That's familiar. The meeting with Amelia Bones was on December 27th. Harry fled to Gringotts in the morning and was taken to the formal legal chambers, a larger room than any he'd been in at the bank before, long table, formal chairs, the Gringotts crest on the wall in dark metal, and the quality of a room that had seen significant decisions and remembered them. Amelia Bones was already there. She was a solidly built woman of middle age with a monocle that she wore with the ease of someone who had stopped self-consciously years ago, and short gray-streaked hair, and the quality of someone for whom the truth was not a preference but a functional requirement. She looked at Harry when he came in with the honest assessment of someone who was noting what was there rather than what she expected. "Lord Potter," she said. "Madam Bones." He sat across from her. Ironclaw and Sharp Fong were at the end of the table. "Thank you for coming. I have questions." "I assumed you would." "Please." She had a folder. She opened it with the efficiency of someone who had prepared thoroughly and didn't intend to waste the preparation. The audit findings. The 63,000 galleons, the Greater Good Educational Foundation. I've done my own trace on the Foundation's registration documents. She looked up. Gringotts' version of events is accurate. Yes. The lease arrangements. The emergency provisions. She flipped a page. Also accurate. Yes. The Wisengamot voting record. The 3 vacant seats. I've cross-referenced the past decade of Wisengamot votes with the margin analysis. She put down a second document. 14 votes in 10 years where the Potter-Peveril-Gryffindor seats would have been the deciding margin. Of those 14, 11 went in favor of legislation that expanded ministry authority over privately held magical estates and reduced goblin banking autonomy. Harry looked at the document. He hadn't done this particular analysis yet, he'd known the seats were functioning as abstentions but hadn't mapped the specific votes. Which means whoever knew those seats were vacant and was watching the Wizengamot vote schedule knew when to push certain legislation through. She looked at him levelly. I'm not saying Dumbledore engineered the absences. I'm saying the absences were useful to a pattern of legislation that I have been trying to challenge for 5 years from my own seat with insufficient numbers. Harry sat back. He thought, she doesn't want the seats for strategy. She wants the law enforced correctly. The pattern of legislation is the thing she cares about. The proxy arrangement, he said. If you serve as proxy for my 3 seats, you'd be voting the estate's position, which I'd need to brief you on before each session, but the estate's general position is for the protection of hereditary rights, goblin banking autonomy, and limitation of ministry authority over private magical property. That's conveniently aligned with my own position. Yes. That's why your name was first on my list. She studied him. You put me first. The third name was last on the letter but first on my actual list. The order in which I gave the names to Gringotts was strategic, I didn't want the most significant name to appear obvious. But you were always the first choice. Why? Because you're not a reformer, Harry said. Reformers want to change things to reflect their vision. You want the law to do what it says it does. Those are very different motivations, and yours is the one that serves this situation better. He paused. And because if this goes to a formal Wizengamot presentation in January, having you as proxy means the audit is presented by someone whose name on the document carries independent legal weight. Gringotts is thorough, but Gringotts is goblins, and the Wizengamot still has members who will dismiss a goblin-authored audit as motivated. She was quiet for a moment. You're 11 years old, she said, in the same tone Ragnarok had used 2 years ago. I'm aware. My niece Susan is in your year at Hogwarts. She came home at Christmas and talked about you. Harry had met Susan Bones in herbology and found her thoughtful and careful in the way people were when they'd grown up knowing the world could be genuinely dangerous. She's good, he said. Particularly in herbology. She and Neville have been doing some excellent work on the estate ground species identification. Something shifted in Amelia Bones' expression, something that was not strictly professional and was better for it. She said you were careful with people, she said. That you noticed things. I try to. She closed her folder. I'll serve as proxy. On 3 conditions. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who had negotiated significant things and found the process clarifying. First, I see the full audit documentation before January, not the summary. Every line. Second, I retain the right to vote my own judgment on any matter where the estate's brief position conflicts with a clear legal principle, with advance notification to you through Gringotts. Third, she paused. The third condition is personal. Go ahead. Whatever happens in January. However the Wizengamot responds. You don't settle for acknowledgement of error alone. She met his eyes. You push for the formal repayment, the legal framework change, and the estate registry update. All 3. Don't accept a partial resolution because it feels like enough in the room. Harry looked at her. You've been in situations where people accepted partial resolutions. Many times. And every time, the part that wasn't resolved became the foundation for the next problem. She picked up her quill. So. Do we have an arrangement? Yes, Harry said. We do. Sharpfong produced the proxy documents with the air of someone who had been waiting patiently for this moment, and they signed, and it was done. January arrived with snow and the Wizengamot session date confirmed on a Thursday letter, the 14th. Harry told his friends at dinner. Hermione immediately began reading about Wisengamot procedure, which she had already been reading about for 3 weeks and found that her reading had prepared her well. Ron said, "Good luck," with genuine feeling and passed the potatoes. Neville, who had been very quiet during the explanation, said, "Do you want company?" "Not in the session, I know it's formal. But after." "Yes," Harry said. "Thank you." He wrote to Ironclaw, to Amelia Bones, to Sharpfang. He reviewed his copy of the audit twice. He read through the estate records one more time, not looking for new information but reinforcing what he knew, the way you reviewed a map before walking somewhere important. He went to see Dumbledore the evening of the 13th. Not because he had to. Because it felt right, not to warn him, exactly, since Dumbledore's own solicitors had already informed him of the session. But because the conversation at Privet Drive, the one in the office in September, the one in the library at Christmas, he and Dumbledore had been in a series of honest conversations, and starting the most significant one without speaking privately first felt wrong. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up when Harry came in and something in his face acknowledged what tomorrow was without requiring it to be said. "Sit down, Harry." Harry sat. Fawkes made a soft sound. The instruments turned. "The Foundation," Dumbledore said. "The research. I imagine you've read it. All of it. And the Horcrux theory is probably correct," Harry said. "The soul fragment assessment, I think the researcher is right about what happened in 1981. He watched Dumbledore's face. "You know what the implication is?" "Yes." Dumbledore looked at the desk surface. "I have known for some time. And you weren't going to tell me." "I was going to tell you." A pause. "When I had a solution." "Do you have one?" "Not yet." "The ancient sacrificial magic approach," Harry said. "The counter-method in the research. Is that viable?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "I believe so. In theory. The mechanism that protected you in 1981, your mother's sacrifice, it established a precedent in your blood. The same order of magic, applied again, might be able to excise the fragment." He paused. "But I don't know how to induce it." "Your mother's sacrifice was not planned. It was real," Harry said. "Yes." They sat with that. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "The session. I want you to know that this isn't about hurting you. I don't have any interest in humiliating you or damaging the school or causing chaos in the Wisengamot." "I know that," Dumbledore said, quietly. "What I want is the record. The correct legal record. The properties and the accounts restored properly. And I want," he stopped, because this next part was the one he'd been least sure how to say. "I want you to understand that I would have helped you. If you'd told me what you were dealing with. The Horcruxes, the research, the question of how to end this properly, I would have been part of it. I am part of it whether you involve me or not. But there's a difference between being used as a piece in someone else's plan and choosing to be where you are." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. "You are," he said, finally, "the most extraordinary 11-year-old I have ever encountered." "I'm not trying to be extraordinary," Harry said. "I'm trying to be treated like a person who has a stake in their own life." The quiet that followed was the longest of all their conversations. Fawkes shifted on his perch. The fire crackled. Outside the circular window the grounds were deep in snow, silver-white in the moonlight, the perimeter wards running their ambient hum that Harry could feel in the back of his mind like a familiar voice. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. "Not as preamble. Not as strategy. As a fact, stated plainly." "Yes," Harry said. "You do." "I have been," he stopped. Started again. "I have been making decisions about your life, your resources, and your safety under the assumption that my judgment was sufficient substitute for your own. That the ends justified the means. That the needs of the many," he paused, and the pause was meaningful, justified the taking from the one. He looked at his hands. I convinced myself it was necessary. I may have been right about some parts of it and wrong about others. But I was wrong to not involve you. Harry listened to this. He tested it against his knowledge of Dumbledore, against the 8 years of records and the audit and the letters and the conversations. He thought it was genuine, as far as it went. Thank you, he said. For saying that. I cannot promise you I won't do it again, Dumbledore said. I don't think I'm built differently. I see patterns over long horizons and I act on what I see, and I don't always remember that the people in the pattern are not pieces. I know, Harry said. That's why there's going to be a record tomorrow. He stood up. Not to punish you. So that when you're tempted to act on the long horizon at someone else's expense, there's a document that says what happens when you do. He walked to the door. He stopped. Professor. Whatever happens with Quirrell and the stone, don't do it without telling me. I'm not asking to lead the response. I'm asking to be informed. Dumbledore looked at him. How much do you know? Enough to know it's coming soon. The desperation is getting visible. He looked at the ceiling, the enchanted sky currently white with cloud, no stars. This is my school. My wards. I have a right to know what's happening in it. Yes, Dumbledore said. You do. Then we have an agreement. He went back down the moving staircase and along the corridor toward Gryffindor Tower, and the castle hummed around him, and he thought about tomorrow. The Wizengamot session was held in a circular chamber underground, deep enough that you felt the weight of the city above it, the way old institutional spaces always pressed their history down on you. The Wizengamot members sat in tiered seats running the circumference of the chamber, their purple robes making the space look like a bruise around the central floor. Dumbledore was at the podium at the top, Chief Warlock, presiding, silver and still and present in the way he was always present. Harry sat in the allocated observer gallery with Ironclaw beside him and Sharpfang on the other side, flanked by the Gringotts legal representation in their formal dark robes. He wore his best clothes, which were new. Ironclaw had suggested formal wizarding dress and he'd agreed, and the robes were deep green and well-fitted and felt like arriving in the right register. Amelia Bones sat in the Wizengamot seats, in the Potter Peverell Gryffindor seats that had been empty for 10 years, wearing her monocle and her professional stillness and looking at the central floor with the patience of someone who had been working toward this for longer than Harry had been alive. She caught his eye across the chamber and gave the smallest possible nod. Sharpfang rose at the designated time and presented the audit. He was extraordinary at it, the numbers delivered without emotion, the timeline established with the precision of a master craftsman fitting stones, the legal framework violations cited with chapter, verse, and historical precedent. He was not performative. He did not editorialize. He stated what was there, calmly and completely, and let the stated facts carry the weight they actually had. The chamber was very quiet by the end. Dumbledore presided with the stillness of someone who had prepared himself for this the way you prepared for something you couldn't avoid and had decided to face without flinching. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He allowed the full account to be given, and Harry watched him across the chamber and thought, that, at least, is the thing he's doing right. When Sharpfang finished, several members spoke. Some were confused. Some were outraged, genuinely, viscerally, the way people were outraged when institutions they trusted were proven to have been misused. One, an older man with the bearing of someone from an old house, said very loudly that this was clearly goblin fabrication, which Amelia Bones addressed from her seat in a voice so precisely controlled it was the verbal equivalent of a scalpel, citing the independent legal trace she'd run on the Foundation documents and her own corroborating analysis of the voting record, and the older man sat down. Lucius Malfoy was present. Harry had noted him in the second tier before the session began, silver blonde, immaculate, watching everything with the eyes of a man who was calculating 3 things simultaneously. He had said nothing yet. He was the most interesting person in the room besides Dumbledore, because his silence was not the silence of someone waiting for the right moment, it was the silence of someone who had already decided on their position and was watching to confirm that the room was moving the way they'd calculated. He met Harry's eyes once, across the chamber, with an expression that was entirely unreadable and therefore significant. Harry looked back evenly and then looked away. When the floor was opened for response, Dumbledore rose from the podium. The chamber went still in the particular way it went still for him, the weight of his reputation and his history and his genuine significance in the room pressing the air flat. "The findings of this audit are, in the main, accurate," he said. His voice was even. "The arrangements I made in 1981 were made under circumstances of extraordinary urgency, in the belief that they were necessary for the protection of the Potter heir and the preservation of resources that might be needed in a continued conflict with Lord Voldemort." He paused at the name, several members flinched, and continued. "I believed I was acting in the best interests of Harry Potter and the wider magical community. I still believe that was my intention." A pause. The chamber waited. "However," he said, and the word landed like something placed carefully, "intention is not sufficient justification for the misuse of another person's estate. The emergency provisions were exceeded. The financial disbursements were not properly accounted for. The lease arrangements were maintained beyond any legal justification." He looked at the central floor rather than the gallery where Harry sat. "I was wrong. Not in my aims, but in my methods. And the correct response to being wrong is to correct what was wrong." He looked up then, and his eyes found Harry in the gallery with the precision of someone who knew exactly where he was sitting. "Lord Potter is owed a full accounting, the return of misappropriated funds, and the formal recognition of his inheritance claims. I do not oppose any of these remedies." The chamber erupted. Not in the way chambers erupted when something went badly, but in the complicated, difficult way of many different people processing a significant thing and having different responses to it, voices layered over voices, the sounds of an institution confronting itself. Harry sat very still and watched Dumbledore hold the podium with perfect composure while the chamber found its way to quiet. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the specific, clean feeling of something being put right after a long time of being wrong, not dramatic, not electric, but real. The way the rosebush had looked when he'd finally gotten the soil balance correct, just better than it had been. Just properly itself. Amelia Bones called order from her seat with a single word that cut through the noise, and the chamber listened because she was the kind of person chambers listened to, and the Wizengamot moved to vote. The formal recognition of Harry's inheritance claims passed 81 to 12. The remediation order, return of funds, formal end of all emergency provision arrangements, estate registry update, passed 77 to 16. The motion for an independent review committee for the use of Wizengamot emergency provisions going forward, which Amelia Bones put forward herself from the floor, passed 68 to 23. Harry watched each vote come in with the same stillness. Lucius Malfoy voted yes on all three, which Harry had expected and noted. Sharpfang made a small sound beside Harry that was the goblin equivalent of satisfaction. "Well done," Ironclaw said, very quietly. "Sharpfang did the work," Harry said. "Yes. And you built the conditions for the work to matter." She was already making notes. "The registry update will take 6 weeks. The funds transfer, pending Dumbledore's solicitor process, approximately 3 months." She paused. "The review committee is the most significant outcome." "I know." He watched Amelia Bones accepting congratulations from several members with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't find congratulations as useful as next steps. The committee changes the structural thing. The individual remediation is important, but it's one case. The committee means the next time someone tries this, there's a process that catches it. "Yes," Ironclaw said. "You do understand this." "You've been good teachers," Harry said. She made another note that might have been hiding a smile. Dumbledore descended from the podium when the chamber began to clear, and the members flowed around him with the complicated social choreography of people who respected someone and were also recalibrating that respect in real time. He moved through it with the dignity of someone who had decided to face the consequences of what they'd done and found the facing, at least, uncomplicated. He walked to the gallery. He looked at Harry. 63,000 galleons, he said, quietly enough that it was just for Harry. Plus interest at the standard Gringotts rate. I've already instructed my solicitors. Thank you, Harry said. The Horcrux research. My personal notes, not the funded documents, my own working notes. I'll have them sent to you through Gringotts. Harry looked at him. You were right, Dumbledore said simply. You have a stake in your own life. The information belongs to you. A pause. I would like, if you're willing, to work together on the question of the fragment. In you. I've been trying to solve it alone for years and I haven't managed it. Yes, Harry said. That's always been what I wanted. I know, Dumbledore said. I should have known it earlier. He straightened, and he was tall and ancient and genuinely formidable, and there was something in his face that had not been there in any of their previous conversations, not defeat, not quite. More like a man who had set down something very heavy and found that his hands were still his. You are going to be remarkable, Harry. I already am, Harry said, mildly, because it was true and because he'd learned from reading his mother's history that she didn't wait for permission to know her own worth. The question is what I'm going to do with it. Dumbledore almost laughed. It was a real almost. Harry walked out of the Wizengamot chamber with Ironclaw and Sharpfang, through the stone corridors and up toward the ordinary world, and outside it was grey January London, cold and ordinary and entirely unconcerned with what had just happened underground. He took a breath of the cold air and thought about the castle waiting for him, and Hermione with her 300 questions still being catalogued, and Neville and the ancient plants along the frost line, and Ron's reliable easy warmth, and Quirrell's turban that moved when it shouldn't, and 6 Horcruxes in the world that needed finding, and 1 potential fragment in him that needed a solution that hadn't been invented yet. He thought, plenty of work left. He thought it with something close to satisfaction.